There is a specific kind of quiet that settles in when you put on a show you have seen 100 times. The dialogue plays out in patterns you already know by heart. The jokes land in the same places they always land. The characters move through their routines like they are reading from a script you have memorized alongside them. And somewhere in the gentle, familiar hum of it all, something inside you just lets go. Family Guy has been that show for millions of people for over 25 years now. It has been the background noise of late nights and early mornings, the soft animated companion to insomnia and long evenings on the couch. And there is something genuinely interesting about why a show that gets discussed, debated, criticized, and praised in such extreme measures has also become one of the most dependably relaxing things you can put on when you want your brain to stop working for a while. Tonight, we are going to spend some time with this strange, resilient, maddeningly inconsistent piece of television history. We are going to move through its story the way you move through a long, unhurried conversation slowly, with plenty of space to breathe, without any rush to get anywhere in particular. If you fall asleep somewhere in the middle, that is exactly as it should be. And if you stay awake all the way through, there is genuinely quite a lot to think about. Get comfortable. Let your breathing slow. This one is going to take a while. The question of what makes animated comedy work at a fundamental level is one that Family Guy's history illuminates unusually well, precisely because the show existed at such different quality levels across its run that comparing different seasons is almost like comparing different shows. The early seasons demonstrate the conditions under which animated comedy can be genuinely excellent. The later seasons demonstrate what happens when those conditions are not maintained. The gap between them is large enough and clear enough that the lessons are unusually legible. The first condition is character investment. The audience must care about the characters. This sounds obvious, but it is not trivially achieved. Caring about a cartoon character requires that the character have genuine interiority that the audience feel, even in the absence of any realistic claim to doing so, that there is something real inside the animated figure, something that wants things and fears things and can be surprised and hurt and changed. The early Family Guy characters had this. Peter's love for Lois felt real. Brian's yearning for a version of himself that could finish the novel felt real. Stewie's cold and absolute commitment to his ambitions felt real, in the specific way that the absolute commitments of very small children feel real. You cared what happened to these characters because you believed in them. The second condition is consequence. Things that happen in the story must matter. Characters must bear the weight of what has happened to them, rather than resetting at the start of each new episode. This does not require a serialized narrative in the way that prestige drama requires serialized narrative. It does not require permanent, dramatic character transformation. It requires only that actions and events leave some trace that the character who did something yesterday is slightly different from the character who will do something tomorrow, that the world the characters inhabit has a memory. The third condition is the relationship between the humor and everything else. In the best comedy, the humor is not separate from the story and character work, but is produced by it, is the product of characters who are real enough and situations that are truthful enough, that the comedy arises organically from the collision between them. The early Family Guy achieved this regularly. The jokes that landed hardest were jokes that could only have been made about these specific characters in these specific situations, not jokes that could have been imported from any other context or placed in any other episode. These three conditions, investment, consequence, organic humor, were present in the first 3 seasons and were progressively eroded over the seasons that followed. Not all at once, not evenly, with occasional episodes that restored them temporarily, but in the aggregate, steadily, as the accumulated choices of many seasons pushed the show further from the conditions that had made it work. Section 1. The birth of something weird and wonderful. The story of Family Guy begins, as so many good stories do, with a young person who had something they needed to make. Seth MacFarlane was born on the 26th of October 1973 in Kent, Connecticut. From a very early age, he was the kind of kid who drew obsessively characters, creatures, figures from the cartoons he watched on Saturday mornings. His parents recognized something in him that went beyond ordinary childhood enthusiasm for cartoons. He was not just consuming animation, he was studying it, trying to understand how it worked, what made characters feel like characters rather than shapes on a screen, why certain stories landed and others evaporated the moment they were over. He studied animation at the Rhode Island School of Design, which is one of the most respected art and design programs in the United States. It sits in Providence, Rhode Island, a compact and somewhat underrated city on the eastern coast of the country, and the state itself would become permanently embedded in the mythology of Family Guy later, but we are getting ahead of ourselves. While McFarlane was still at school, he made an animated short film called The Life of Larry. It was a simple thing in terms of production. A man named Larry and his talking dog named Steve. Not polished by any professional standard, not the kind of thing that would get greenlit at a major studio based on its raw execution alone. But the people who saw it recognized something in the comedic sensibility behind it. There was a voice there. A specific, slightly absurd, unexpectedly heartfelt point of view that had something to say about the relationship between a not very smart man and his smarter-than-he-lets-on dog. Executives at Hanna-Barbera saw the short and offered McFarlane a job. He graduated from design school and went to work in Los Angeles at one of the most storied animation studios in the history of the medium. While he was there, he worked on shows like Johnny Bravo, Cow and Chicken, and Dexter's Laboratory. These were not obscure programs. Johnny Bravo was a mainstay of Cartoon Network. Dexter's Laboratory had a particular kind of clever, layered humor that kids could enjoy on one level, while adults found something else entirely in it. McFarlane was absorbing all of this. He was in the room where a particular kind of comedy was being made, learning the rhythms of it, seeing what worked and what didn't at a pace that most developing animators and writers would have envied. In 1996, he made a follow-up short called Larry and Steve, which aired on Cartoon Network's What a Cartoon Showcase, a programming block that also helped launch Dexter's Laboratory and the Powerpuff Girls, among others. That short caught the attention of people at Fox Broadcasting. Not Cartoon Network, not an animation imprint, but Fox, a major broadcast network that was, at that particular moment in the mid to late 1990s, genuinely hungry for animated content that could perform with adult audiences the way The Simpsons had been doing since 1989. Fox approached McFarlane. They asked him to create a series based on Larry and Steve. He was 23 years old. He had graduated from art school a couple of years earlier and was working as a staff writer and animator on other people's shows, and now one of the big four broadcast networks was asking him to develop his own. He pitched them a 15-minute pilot, which he reportedly created himself at home, and which cost around $50,000 to produce. In May of 1998, he walked into Fox with that pilot and sat down with studio executives Gary Newman and Dana Walden. They were impressed enough to commission the series on the spot. Family Guy was officially in production. The concept had evolved from the Larry shorts in some important ways. Larry had become Peter Griffin, a working-class man living in a fictionalized version of a Rhode Island suburb. Steve the dog had become Brian Griffin, still a talking dog, still the more grounded and intelligent counterpart to his human companion, but now part of a family rather than a simple two-character dynamic. Around Peter and Brian, McFarlane built out a whole household. Lois, Peter's wife, who had a background that suggested a more privileged upbringing than her current circumstances might indicate. Their teenage daughter, Meg. Their son, Chris, who was awkward and sweet and not particularly sharp, but not unkind either. And Stewie, 1-year-old Stewie Griffin, the baby of the family, whose introductory concept was so specific and so strange that it deserves its own moment to describe properly. Stewie Griffin was a baby who spoke with a refined British accent, despite having been born to a thoroughly American family in a thoroughly American suburb, and whose ambitions in life centered almost entirely around world domination and the elimination of his mother. He built weapons in his bedroom. He designed machines that could alter weather patterns and control minds. He spoke like a villain from a 1960s spy film, and the show set him up in such a way that the adults around him mostly could not understand him. They heard him babbling and cooing the way any baby babbles and coos, while the audience watched this infant in a diaper and a yellow shirt calmly describe his plans to subjugate all of humanity before nap time. There has never been quite anything like early Stewie Griffin in the history of animated television. That deserves to be said plainly and without qualification. The concept is so specific, so committed, and so precisely calibrated in its delivery that it almost feels like it shouldn't work. A baby who talks like a Bond villain trying to kill his mother sounds like a sketch premise that wears out after 90 seconds. The fact that it sustained an entire character arc for 3 seasons before evolving into something different is a testament to how fully the original writers understood what made it funny. The cultural moment in which Family Guy existed during its original run is worth understanding clearly, because it helps explain both why the show had the impact it did and why the show that came back in 2005 was operating in a different environment. In January of 1999, when Family Guy premiered, The Simpsons was 10 years old and was in what many critics would later identify as its early decline, still producing quality episodes but no longer consistently achieving the extraordinary work of seasons 3 through 8. South Park had been on the air for 2 years and was finding its voice as a piece of genuinely politically engaged satire. Adult animation as a form was not new, but it was still finding the full range of what it could do and who it could be for. Family Guy arrived into this moment with something specific to offer. It was not trying to be The Simpsons. It was not trying to be South Park. It had its own distinct identity, the cutaway format that allowed a different relationship to comedy than continuous narrative required, the specific sensibility of its creator that blended genuine affection for American working-class life with a willingness to mock and satirize the same things it was affectionate about, the particular character configurations that had never quite existed before. The show was also arriving at a moment when the cultural mood in America was receptive to a certain kind of irreverence. The late 90s had a specific character economically buoyant, politically stable by the standards of what came before and after, culturally willing to be provocative in ways that felt relatively low stakes, because the larger context felt secure. Family Guy's brand of provocative, slightly transgressive comedy was well matched to that mood. The September 11 attacks in 2001 and the cultural shift that followed them changed the context in ways that affected everything in American entertainment, animated comedy very much included. But Family Guy was canceled before that shift fully registered, and came back in 2005 into a country that was in a different mood, more politically polarized, more culturally anxious, more prone to treating entertainment as a site of ideological competition rather than simply as something to enjoy. The post-revival show's increasing political explicitness, particularly through Brian's character, who became more and more a vehicle for liberal political positions across the revival seasons, was a response to this changed context. The writers were operating in an environment where choosing a side on political questions was becoming more normal and more expected in entertainment, where the idea that comedy should be politically neutral was itself a contested position rather than a settled default. Family Guy participated in this shift through Brian, and the participation changed the show in ways that are visible in hindsight even if they seemed reasonable in the moment. The show premiered on the 31st of January 1999. The timing was deliberate and exactly as advantageous as it sounds. Family Guy aired immediately following Super Bowl 33. For a brand new animated comedy on a broadcast network, this was the equivalent of being handed the keys to a packed stadium and told to do your opening set. Millions of people were already watching. The channel was already on. And that first episode, titled Death Has a Shadow, pulled in approximately 22 million viewers. To put that number in context in a way that will become important later, the show that currently airs on Wednesday nights on Fox, the same show that started with 22 million people watching its premiere, recently averaged somewhere around 600,000 viewers per episode. That is not a rounding error or a quirk of measurement methodology. That is a collapse in audience across a period of roughly 2.5 decades that tells a very specific story about what happened to this show, but we are nowhere near that part of the story yet. The first season consisted of only 7 episodes. Fox had ordered the show and placed it in a relatively favorable slot for the initial run, but it was clearly still being treated as something that needed to prove itself, which it did reasonably well. The first season averaged around 12.8 million households tuning in, which ranked the show at number 33 in the Nielsen ratings for that year. For a new animated comedy in its first season, that was a solid performance. Not spectacular in the way the Super Bowl premiere had suggested it might be, but respectable. And the show itself, in those first 7 episodes and throughout the second and third seasons that followed, was genuinely something. There is a specific quality to the writing of Family Guy in its earliest form that becomes more distinctive the further you move away from it. The humor was irreverent in a way that felt considered rather than reflexive. The show was willing to go to uncomfortable places, to make jokes about subjects that other programs were treating with excessive care, but it did so with enough wit underneath the provocation that the jokes had actual architecture. You could pull one apart and find something deliberately constructed inside it. The characters balanced each other in ways that suggested the people writing them had thought carefully about what each one needed to be. Peter's stupidity was genuine but not inhuman. He functioned in the world. He held a job at a toy factory called the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery. He loved his wife and his kids in the blundering, inarticulate way that certain men love things without being able to say it clearly. There was warmth underneath his foolishness, and that warmth was what kept you from simply disliking him. Lois was the competent patient center of the household. She played piano. She had grown up in a wealthy family and had chosen a life that was significantly less glamorous than her upbringing might have predicted. She tolerated Peter's disasters with a level of humor and grace that occasionally slipped into genuine frustration, and those moments of frustration felt earned rather than manipulative. Meg was an ordinary teenage girl navigating the specific indignity of being unremarkable in a family full of remarkable people. She wanted to be liked and to fit in and to matter, and the comedy of her situation in those early seasons came from how universal that experience is, how recognizable the feeling of being the least interesting person in your own house is for a significant portion of the population. Chris was sweet and dim in ways that came across as affectionate rather than mean. He was drawn with a certain gentleness that made him difficult to dislike. And Brian was, depending on who you asked, the best character on the show. The dry, sardonic dog who drank martinis and drove a car and read actual books and served as Peter's closest friend and most reliable conscience. Brian was the one who made the show feel smart. When the humor threatened to collapse into pure chaos, Brian was there to ground it with a raised eyebrow and a precisely delivered line. The writers who built this world alongside MacFarlane in those early seasons included Chris Sheridan, Danny Smith, Gary Janetti, Ricky Blitt, Neil Goldman, Garrett Donovan, Matt Weitzman, and Mike Barker. These were people who understood the particular combination of absurdist humor and genuine human feeling that makes the best animated comedies work. They were not all famous names. They were not all people who would go on to have high-profile careers in the industry. But they were the right people for this specific project at this specific moment, and the work they produced showed it. MacFarlane himself was present at every level. He was not simply the creator and the voice actor. He was in the writing room, shaping stories, pushing jokes further, pulling others back from edges that didn't serve the show. He had a vision for what Family Guy was, and that vision was coherent and specific enough to guide everything else. The early episodes have a texture to them that is somewhat difficult to describe without just watching them. There is a roughness in the animation. The characters move with a looseness that the more polished later seasons would lose. The jokes arrive at slightly irregular intervals, more like conversation than performance. The family dynamic feels lived in a way that requires genuine character work, not just setup and punchline mechanics. Episodes end with resolution, with something having shifted or been addressed, with the sense that these people went through something together. None of that is accidental. All of it is the product of people who cared about making something good, led by someone who knew exactly what he wanted it to be. If you are watching from somewhere comfortable right now, close your eyes and just let the sound of this settle around you. Somewhere out there, Season 1 of Family Guy is playing on a streaming platform, and it is a different thing from what came later. It is younger, rougher, more uncertain, and somehow more alive for all of that. Drop a comment below and let me and the rest of the community know where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there. There is something genuinely lovely about knowing this video is reaching people across different time zones, different living rooms, different quiet hours of the night. Also, if you are enjoying this and want to make sure you do not miss future uploads, a subscription costs you nothing and it genuinely matters for the channel. Okay, back to the story. The second and third seasons built on the first with a confidence that suggested the writing room had found its rhythm. Episodes like Road to Rhode Island, the Brian and Stewie adventure that premiered in the second season, demonstrated that the show's format could support genuine emotional content alongside the absurdist humor. Brian's visit to the farm where he was born, discovering that his mother had died and been taxidermied by the family who had taken her in, was played with a seriousness that the show rarely attempted and that worked precisely because it was unexpected. The comedy of the episode, which was real and sustained and cleverly constructed, made the moment of genuine sadness land harder because of the contrast. The early seasons also had a specific relationship to pop culture and to American cultural history that was sharper and more precisely targeted than the later seasons' relationship to the same material. The show's cutaway gags in seasons 1 through 3 frequently drew on a specific period of American entertainment, the 70s and 80s, the era of Peter Griffin's cultural formation, in ways that felt like genuine love rather than mere reference. McFarlane's personal affection for mid-century American entertainment, for big band music and classic Hollywood, and the particular texture of late-night talk shows from a specific era, was visible in the show's humor in ways that gave the cultural references warmth rather than merely cleverness. The early musical sequences, in particular, were the product of someone who genuinely loved the music he was working with. When the show staged a period-accurate big band number or organized a comedic set piece around a piece of music from the 40s or 50s, the engagement with the material was real. This authentic enthusiasm translated into comedy that worked at multiple levels, funny to people who recognized the reference, funny in a different way to people who did not, with a layer of genuine affection underneath both. Season 3 introduced several characters and storylines that would become important to the show's mythology. The episode The Kiss Scene Around the World introduced Meg's eventual nemesis Connie D'Amico. Various family members' backstories were developed in episodes that demonstrated the show's willingness to actually build out the characters' histories, rather than simply using them as functions in the current episode's plot. The sense of the Griffin family as a family with a shared past with memories and formative experiences and relationships that had histories was central to what made the early show feel inhabited rather than constructed. The third season also contained the episode Road to Europe, which sent Brian and Stewie to England after Stewie became obsessed with a British children's television program. This episode demonstrated that the Road to format had genuine versatility, that it could be set almost anywhere and used to explore almost any situation, while maintaining the specific dynamic between the two characters that made it work. The European setting gave the writers material for a different kind of comedy than the American settings of the first two seasons, and they used it effectively. The final episode of the original run, Family Guy Viewer Mail No. 1, aired in May of 2002 and was the show's first experiment with an anthology format, 3 separate short stories, each with a slightly different tone and comedic approach. The anthology format was unusual for Family Guy and demonstrated a kind of restlessness and formal experimentation that the early seasons had and that later seasons would largely lose. The willingness to try something structurally different, to risk an experiment rather than simply execute the established format, was a quality of creative confidence that belonged to a show that had not yet calcified into its own conventions. Section 2. The characters who made it matter. Before we can properly understand why Family Guy eventually became something different from what it started as, we need to spend real time with the versions of these characters that existed at the beginning. Because the argument about the show's decline is fundamentally an argument about character, about what happened to specific people over time, and how those changes altered the emotional core of everything built around them. Let us start with Peter Griffin, because Peter is the center of gravity around which the rest of the show orbits. In the early seasons, Peter Griffin embodied a specific comic archetype that has a long and distinguished history in American entertainment. He was the well-meaning fool. The man whose intentions are good but whose execution is spectacularly, reliably, sometimes dangerously bad. His stupidity was not malice. His selfishness was the selfishness of a man who genuinely does not understand the impact of his actions on the people around him, which is a very different thing from a man who understands and simply does not care. He worked hard, in his clumsy way. He loved Lois in the inarticulate but genuine way that certain men love their wives, not with poetry or grand gestures, but with the kind of devotion that shows up in small ways. In the fact that he comes home, in the fact that when things go badly wrong, he does try, however ineptly, to fix them. There were episodes in those first 3 seasons where Peter messed something up in a genuinely consequential way, embarrassed Lois in front of her family, wrecked something important to her, failed his kids in a way that mattered, and then spent the rest of the episode working to make it right. Not always successfully, not always gracefully. But the attempt was real, and the remorse that prompted it was real. That cycle of error and attempted repair is what made Peter watchable. It is what made him something you could care about despite the constant stream of disaster that followed him everywhere. He was funny because he was human, and he was human because the writing gave him genuine feelings underneath all the chaos. Lois functioned as the patient, competent center that kept the household from flying apart entirely. She was not a saint. The show gave her edges and flaws, moments where her patience expired and her behavior became something less than admirable. But she was the person in the family who most reliably saw things clearly, who most reliably understood what was actually happening and what it meant, and who most reliably cared about getting it right. Her relationship with Peter was the emotional backbone of the show. They argued and misunderstood each other and occasionally drove each other to the edge of what either could tolerate, and then they came back together, and the coming back together felt earned. Chris was a gentler character than his eventual role in the show might suggest. He was dim in ways that felt sweet rather than sad. He had interests drawing, a somewhat accidental talent for observation, a good heart that his intelligence couldn't always access. His relationship with Peter had a warmth to it in those early episodes. Peter was not a perfect father to Chris, not by any reasonable measure, but there was affection there that was visible in the small moments between them. And Meg. We need to talk about early Meg with some care, because what happened to Meg Griffin over the course of this show is one of the more genuinely disturbing character trajectories in American animated television, and understanding where she started is essential to understanding the magnitude of that transformation. In seasons 1 through 3, Meg Griffin was just a regular teenage girl, unpopular at her school, a little invisible in her family, wanting things that most teenagers want: to be seen, to be liked, to matter to the people around her. The jokes about Meg in those early seasons were mild. They came from the genuine comedy of being unremarkable in a household that is, by any objective measure, entirely remarkable. When your baby brother is secretly plotting world domination and your dog can discuss 19th century literature, being the normal teenager is inherently funny in a gentle, relatable way. Peter was not a great father to Meg even in those first 3 seasons. He forgot things, said insensitive things, prioritized himself in ways that a better father would not. But there was no cruelty in it. There was no pleasure in diminishing her. There were moments where he showed that he knew she existed, that he thought about her well-being, that he was, within the severe limitations of his own competence, trying. The transformation of Peter's relationship with Meg into something genuinely abusive, which accelerated dramatically from around season 5 onward, is one of the most troubling things the show did, and we will return to it in full. But what is important to note right now, in the context of these early seasons, is that the family dynamics were believably dysfunctional in the way that real families are dysfunctional, with love underneath the mess rather than contempt. Stewie in those early seasons deserves extended discussion because his comedic concept was so specific and so well executed that the entire evolution of his character from season 4 onward has to be understood as a direct departure from something that was genuinely working. The central joke of early Stewie was a contrast, an absolute, unbridgeable, deliberately absurd contrast between what he looked like: a baby in a diaper, sitting in a high chair, being fed mashed carrots by his unsuspecting mother, and what he actually was, which was a megalomaniacal criminal genius plotting the destruction of the woman who fed him and the subjugation of all human civilization. The comedy came from the gap between these two things, and from the way the show committed to both sides of the contradiction simultaneously without ever blinking. He built weapons in his bedroom. Not toy weapons, not imaginary weapons, actual functional weapons. Ray guns, mind control devices, weather-altering machines, time machines. He constructed all of this in the nursery of a suburban house in Rhode Island, and the show treated it with complete, unironic seriousness. Stewie was genuinely dangerous. Not in a way that ever actually hurt anyone. The show was still a comedy, and the attempts on Lois's life were played for laughs, but in a way that carried real menace underneath the humor. His obsession with Lois was specific and relentless, and in its own strange way deeply committed. Nearly every episode in those first 3 seasons had at least one moment where Stewie either attempted to harm his mother or commented on his plans to do so. These were sometimes elaborate multi-step schemes involving devices of his own invention. Sometimes they were just a quiet aside: Stewie sitting in the kitchen while Lois made dinner, murmuring about how the potatoes she was peeling would be a useful weapon if he could just get the timing right. The show kept the jokes fresh by finding new configurations of the same fundamental absurdity, by varying the scale and complexity of Stewie's plans while keeping the core dynamic constant. Brian was the one character who could hear and understand Stewie properly, a narrative convenience that served multiple purposes. It explained why the adults in the show were not simply horrified by what the baby was saying. It established a particular dynamic between the dog and the infant that would grow into one of the most significant relationships in the show's history. And it gave Brian a role in Stewie's world that was different from his role in Peter's world. Not the voice of reason trying to prevent disaster, but something more like a reluctant confidant, an uncomfortable witness to plans he wanted no part of and couldn't entirely stop. The friendship between Brian and Stewie in those early seasons was tentative. It existed mostly in brief exchanges, in moments where Stewie sought out Brian specifically because Brian was the only one who would actually engage with what he was saying. Brian's responses were usually some combination of horror, exasperation, and grudging respect for the sheer ambition of what Stewie was attempting. These small interactions planted the seeds of a relationship that would become the emotional center of the show for many seasons. Brian himself, in those first 3 seasons, was close to a perfect realization of his character concept. He was the dog who was not quite functioning as a dog who lived in a family but existed slightly outside it, educated and observant and quietly burdened by his own limitations in ways that the show addressed with surprising sensitivity. He was a writer who had been working on a novel for years without finishing it. He drank martinis at 11 in the morning and nobody particularly commented on this. He had feelings for Lois that he kept carefully managed and mostly buried, surfacing occasionally in moments of quiet honesty that the show handled with more delicacy than you might expect from a comedy about a talking dog. He was witty without being unkind. He was intellectual without being pretentious about it, or at least without being performatively pretentious, which is an important distinction. He earned his intelligence through the things he said and thought, rather than through constant declarations of how much smarter he was than everyone around him. His relationship with Peter was the kind of friendship where the gap in intelligence between two people is genuinely wide, but the affection is equally genuine. And both things exist simultaneously without either one canceling the other out. When Brian looked at Peter's disasters with weary recognition, there was love in that look alongside the exhaustion. He did not want Peter to be stupid. He was not amused by Peter's failures at any fundamental level. He wanted his friend to do better, and he helped him try, over and over, knowing that it would very rarely work and that the trying was the point. The entire voice cast contributed to making these characters feel alive in ways that scripts alone could not achieve. MacFarlane himself was doing 4 major voices: Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire, with a level of specificity and consistency that represented a remarkable performance achievement even within the context of animation, where voice actors are frequently called upon to inhabit multiple characters. Alex Borstein as Lois brought a wry intelligence to the character that kept her from becoming a simple audience surrogate. Seth Green as Chris found something gentle and unguarded in a character who could easily have been just a dumb kid caricature. Lacey Chabert voiced Meg in the first season before Mila Kunis took over in season 2, and Kunis brought a quality to Meg's frustration and longing that was more nuanced than the character's marginal role in many episodes might have required. The music in those early seasons also deserves mention. Walter Murphy, who had composed the arrangement for Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band that Barry White made famous, provided a score that was richer and more varied than most animated comedy soundtracks of the time. Ron Jones composed episodic music that had genuine texture tense when tension was needed, absurdly grand when grandeur was the joke, quietly melancholy when the show found one of its unexpected emotional notes. All of this, the characters, the performances, the music, the writing, added up to something that felt, in its best moments, like a complete and considered piece of work. Not perfect, never perfect, but coherent, made by people who understood what they were building and why. Imagine settling into a warm, softly lit room on a night like this. The hum of something comfortable playing in the background. A story that you already know the shape of, unfolding at exactly the pace you need it to. These early seasons of Family Guy are that feeling in animated form, the rough edges and all. The relationship between Brian and Peter in the early seasons deserves more attention than it typically receives in discussions of the show, Because it was one of the most precisely calibrated comic relationships in the history of animated comedy, and understanding it clearly illuminates how much was lost when it deteriorated. The specific dynamic between them was built on an asymmetry of intelligence that both characters were aware of, and that both managed in specific ways. Brian was significantly smarter than Peter. He knew this. Peter was significantly less smart than Brian. He knew this too, in his approximate and unsentimental way, without it being a source of particular distress. The asymmetry existed, was acknowledged, and did not prevent the friendship from being genuine and reciprocal. What Brian offered Peter was not the intelligence itself. Peter could not use Brian's intelligence any more than he could use a thermometer he did not understand. What Brian offered was attention, genuine engagement. The particular quality of presence that comes from someone who sees you clearly, understands your patterns and your limitations, and the specific ways you tend to get things wrong, and remains your friend not despite all of this, but alongside it. What Peter offered Brian was more complicated, and, in its own way, more touching. He offered Brian a home, and a role, and a relationship in which Brian's specific kind of intelligence, the sardonic, literary, somewhat alcoholic intelligence of a failed writer in an ordinary family, had context and purpose. Left to his own devices, Brian might have spent more of his time alone with his unfinished novel and his martini glass, stewing in the particular melancholy of someone who knows he is capable of more than his life currently contains. In the Griffin household, with Peter requiring his involvement and his counsel, Brian had something to do. He was needed, and being needed, even when being needed is frequently embarrassing, is its own form of fulfillment. Their arguments had a specific rhythm that both characters recognized, and that the show rendered with genuine craft. Peter would announce some new plan. Brian would identify the flaws in the plan, often quite precisely. Peter would ignore the identification. Things would go wrong in exactly the ways Brian had predicted. Brian would help clean up. Peter would offer some combination of gratitude and bafflement. The cycle would complete and reset. This cycle was not boring, because the situations that triggered it were varied enough to keep it fresh, and because the performances McFarlane doing both voices, maintaining perfect consistency in their distinct registers, were executed with unfailing precision. The dissolution of this dynamic was not a single event. It happened through accumulation, through the way that Brian's character drift changed the nature of what he brought to the relationship. The Brian who had been genuinely loyal, who had helped clean up Peter's messes because he genuinely cared about Peter, was replaced over time by a Brian who was increasingly occupied with his own interests and his own grievances. The friendship became less central to his characterization. The scenes between them lost the specific warmth that had made them feel real. By the middle and late seasons, the Peter-Brian dynamic had largely given way to the Stewie-Brian dynamic as the show's primary relationship. This was not entirely a loss. The Stewie-Brian relationship had its own genuine qualities. But the Peter-Brian friendship had been the emotional center of the show in its original form, the relationship that grounded all the other comedy in something recognizably human, and its diminishment left a structural vacancy that the Stewie-Brian partnership, excellent as it was, could only partially fill. Section 3. Cancelled, resurrected, and changed forever. What happened to Family Guy between 2000 and 2005 is one of the stranger stories in the history of American television, and it is worth moving through it slowly because it helps explain so much of what the show became after its return. The first season had performed reasonably well, not explosively, but solidly. Family Guy had an audience, it had critical attention, and it had a creator who was demonstrably talented. But it also had Fox, which in those early years treated the show with a scheduling philosophy that can most charitably be described as incoherent. During the second season, which premiered in September of 1999, Fox moved Family Guy to Thursday nights at 9 o'clock in the evening. This placed it in direct competition with Frasier on NBC, which was at that point one of the most reliable ratings performers on American television. Frasier was in the middle of its long and celebrated run. It had a devoted audience. The idea that a fledgling animated comedy in its second season was going to go head-to-head with Frasier and come out ahead was not a realistic expectation, and the ratings reflected that. Fox moved the show again, then again. It bounced from Tuesday nights to other slots, shuffled around the schedule without the kind of consistent placement that allows an audience to build a habit around watching a show. In an era before streaming and on-demand viewing, before DVRs were in widespread use and before anyone could simply pull up a missed episode on a phone, the time slot was everything. If you did not know when a show was on and your television was not reliably tuned to it at that specific time, you simply did not watch that show. Fox was actively preventing Family Guy from building the consistent viewership it needed to survive. After the third season, in 2002, Fox canceled Family Guy for what appeared to be the final time. The show had accumulated 3 seasons and was being canceled for the second time. It had faced an earlier cancellation threat after Season 2 before receiving a reprieve that allowed Season 3 to be produced. But now, Fox made it official. Family Guy was done. Except that something happened almost immediately after the cancellation that nobody had anticipated. Cartoon Network, which was operating its late-night Adult Swim block for adult-oriented animated programming, acquired the rights to rerun the first 3 seasons of Family Guy. They got those rights cheaply, because nobody thought a recently canceled show was worth much. The deal that seemed like Fox's leftovers turned out to be one of the best investments in Adult Swim's history. The reruns premiered on Adult Swim on the 20th of April 2003, and within weeks, something extraordinary was happening. Family Guy was not just performing well on Adult Swim, it was dominating the block. According to Entertainment Weekly, the reruns boosted Adult Swim's viewership by 239%. They averaged around 1.9 million viewers per episode in that late-night slot, a remarkable number for a rerun of a canceled show on a cable network that was still finding its audience. At almost exactly the same time, the DVD sets for the first 2 seasons of Family Guy were released. DVD television sets were still a relatively new commercial phenomenon in 2003, and there was not yet a fully established market for them in the way that would develop over the subsequent few years. But the Family Guy sets moved at a pace that astonished the people who had priced them. The first season set alone sold more than 2 million copies, making it one of the best-selling television DVDs of 2003. One report placed it as the second best-selling television DVD release of all time at that point, behind only the first season of Chappelle's Show. People were not just watching the reruns, they were buying the show. They were purchasing physical copies, putting them on shelves, lending them to friends, bringing them to college dormitories, and playing them in communal spaces where new people encountered Family Guy for the first time and immediately went looking for more. A show that Fox had canceled twice was generating a cult following of significant size and considerable commercial value, Fox noticed. The network that had twice decided Family Guy was not worth keeping on the air now sat with the strange knowledge that the audience had decided otherwise. By the summer of 2004, Fox made the decision to bring the show back. A 4th season was ordered. Family Guy was returning. The fan reaction was enormous. This kind of reversal, a canceled show coming back because its audience demanded it loudly enough, was not common. It was, in fact, close to unprecedented. Shows got canceled and stayed canceled. The mechanisms by which television decisions were made were largely invisible to viewers, and those viewers had very limited tools for making their preferences known to networks in any structured way. The DVD sales provided exactly the kind of measurable, quantifiable signal that networks could act on, and the Adult Swim ratings provided supporting data in a format that TV executives were comfortable reading. When Fox announced the return of Family Guy, it was treated as a genuine television event. Seth MacFarlane spoke publicly about how surprising and validating the experience of the cancellation and revival had been. The writing team was being reassembled, new episodes were in production, and the show would return in May of 2005 as part of Fox's Sunday night animation domination lineup alongside The Simpsons, King of the Hill, and MacFarlane's new show American Dad, which had premiered in February of that year. But here is the thing that becomes crucial when you look back at this story from a significant distance. The 3 years between the cancellation and the revival changed things. They changed things in ways that were not immediately visible when the show came back, in ways that would only become clear in retrospect as the seasons accumulated and the patterns solidified. The writing staff had scattered during the cancellation. Writers move on. They find new work. They develop other projects. You cannot reasonably expect a writing team to hold itself together for 3 years waiting for a show that has been canceled and that may never come back. When MacFarlane reassembled the team for the revival, some of the original writers returned and some did not. New writers were brought in. The room was different from what it had been in 2001. MacFarlane himself acknowledged this directly in interviews. One of the consequences of the show's turbulent early history, being canceled once and then canceled again, being shuffled around the schedule, was that they were constantly having to rebuild the writing staff. Institutional knowledge was lost in those gaps. The specific understanding of what the show was, built up through the experience of making it, had to be partially reconstructed each time new writers came in. The 3-year gap also changed the cultural context around the show in ways that matter. Family Guy came back into a television landscape that was starting to change rapidly. YouTube launched in 2005, the same year as Family Guy's return. The internet was increasingly a place where short video clips could be shared virally, where a 30-second cutaway gag could reach millions of people who had never watched the full episode it came from. The show's comedic format, those brief, self-contained cutaway gags, was almost perfectly calibrated for this emerging mode of content consumption. That compatibility between Family Guy's format and the emerging internet video landscape would shape the show's creative choices in ways that had not been true in the original run. If a certain type of joke was going viral, there was a commercial incentive to make more jokes like it. If the cutaways were what people were clipping and sharing, then the cutaways were what the show increasingly prioritized. None of this was inevitable. None of it had to happen in exactly the way it did. But it created conditions under which the show's priorities gradually shifted from telling stories about these characters to generating moments that would work out of context, on a computer screen, disconnected from the episode around them. That shift did not arrive fully formed with the 4th season. It took time. But the seeds of it were planted in the gap between the cancellation and the revival, in the changing landscape the show returned to, and in the different writing room that was making it. The show came back. The audience celebrated. And something, quietly and without announcement, had already changed. Section 4. The Crack in the Foundation Seasons 4 and 5. Season 4 of Family Guy premiered on the 1st of May 2005. The return was, by any objective measure, a success. Fox had placed the show in the middle of their Sunday night animation domination lineup, and it drew the audience that the Adult Swim ratings and DVD sales had promised. People who had discovered Family Guy through reruns showed up. People who had watched the original run and mourned its cancellation showed up. The numbers were strong. The hype was real. But if you watch Season 4 now, back to back with Seasons 2 and 3, you can feel something different even in the earliest episodes. The difference is subtle at first. It shows up in the texture of things rather than in any single dramatic change. The animation looks slightly different, cleaner in some ways, slightly stiffer in others. The timing of jokes is a little different. The rhythm between character scenes and cutaway gags has shifted, not dramatically, but perceptibly. The animation change is worth dwelling on for a moment because animation in a cartoon is not just cosmetic. The way characters move affects the way jokes land. The looseness or tightness of the drawing style carries emotional information. In the first 3 seasons, especially the 2nd and 3rd, which were produced by Rough Draft Studios, the characters had an expressiveness, a slightly fluid, slightly exaggerated quality in how they moved their faces and bodies that made their reactions feel alive. When Peter was startled or excited or horrified, his face communicated that in a way that had genuine comedic timing built into it. The animation for Season 4 had a different quality. The outlines were heavier, the movements were more constrained. The characters were recognizably themselves, but they moved with less spontaneity. Technical improvements in the production process had made the show look more polished, and in making it more polished, something of the energetic roughness that had made it feel handmade was smoothed away. The more significant change was in the writing room and in what it was producing. Alex Sulkin joined the writing staff during this period. Richard Appel would come in later. These were not bad writers. Both would go on to significant careers in television, but they brought sensibilities that were somewhat different from the original team, and the show began reflecting those differences. The cutaway gags started to change their relationship to the episodes around them. In the early seasons, the cutaways were structurally subordinate to the main story. A character would make a comparison, "This is worse than the time I did such and such," and the show would briefly cut to a visual illustration of that comparison before returning to the scene. The cutaway existed in service of the moment it interrupted. It added a joke to the scene without replacing the scene. In Season 4, the cutaways started getting longer. They started arriving more frequently. And crucially, They started to function less as additions to scenes and more as replacements for them. You could feel episodes beginning to use cutaways as a way of covering narrative territory that the main story was not bothering to develop. Instead of a scene where two characters had a conversation that moved the plot forward and revealed something about who they were, there would be a cutaway gag, then another. Then the plot would jump forward, something would be assumed to have happened off-screen, and another cutaway would arrive to fill the space where character work might have been. The show was discovering something that was commercially very useful and creatively somewhat dangerous. That cutaways were popular, that they traveled well on the emerging internet platforms where clips were being shared, that they could generate laughs independent of everything around them. The incentive structure was pushing toward more cutaways, longer cutaways, cutaways that were more extreme and memorable. And the show was responding to that incentive. Stewie's transformation began accelerating in this season in ways that were visible enough to prompt conversation. The evil baby who had been planning world domination since before he could walk was starting to show more of what the writers described as his softer side. The world domination plots became less central to his storylines. The attempts on Lois's life, which had been a near-weekly ritual in the early seasons, were becoming occasional rather than constant. Stewie's friendship with Brian was moving to the foreground, and their dynamic was shifting from Stewie needing Brian as an intellectual companion who would actually engage with his plans to something more like mutual reliance. Two characters who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. The emerging friendship had genuine charm. MacFarlane and the writers had good instincts about what made Brian and Stewie's dynamic work, and the episode centered on the two of them traveling together. The Road to episodes that were already a beloved franchise within the show were often the strongest episodes of this period. Road to Rupert from Season 5 was a particular standout. The warmth between the two characters was real, and the comedy that emerged from their contrasting personalities was well calibrated. But the trade-off was beginning to register. Stewie was becoming more like a supporting character in his own story, reacting to situations, developing emotionally, being shaped by his friendship with Brian. He was becoming someone you could sympathize with in a straightforward way. And in doing that, he was losing the unpredictability that had made every scene with him carry a specific charge of dangerous energy. The early Stewie was the kind of character where you genuinely did not know what was going to happen next, because he operated according to his own internal logic, rather than the logic of conventional storytelling. He might suddenly produce a weapon. He might deliver a monologue about the inevitability of humanity's subjugation. He might casually mention that he had been poisoning Lois's breakfast for a week. That uncertainty was a source of comedy, but also of genuine interest. It made him feel like a wild card in his own show. The newer Stewie was becoming more predictable in the ways that likable characters tend to be predictable. He would feel things. He would express those feelings eventually, probably to Brian. He would have a moment of growth or vulnerability or recognition. He was becoming more like a character in a story, and less like a dangerous force inside one. Peter's character was also beginning to shift in Season 4, though the changes here were more subtle and would take longer to become fully visible. The stupidity that had always been part of his character began to push toward extremes that occasionally felt less like exaggeration and more like a different kind of character entirely. There were moments in Season 4 where Peter's behavior crossed the line from lovable foolishness into something that had a harder edge, where his self-interest caused genuine harm to people around him, and the episode did not quite hold him accountable for it the way the earlier seasons reliably had. Brian's political soapboxing, which had always been a background element of his character, was starting to move toward the foreground. Episodes were beginning to use Brian as a vehicle for statements about social and political issues in ways that felt less like Brian as character and more like Brian as mouthpiece. When a character who used to have a rich internal life begins to flatten out into a position paper, something essential is being lost, even if the positions being advocated are entirely reasonable. Season 5, which ran from 2006 to 2007, continued these trajectories while also producing some episodes that are genuinely among the best the show ever made. The season premiere, Stewie Loves Lois, explored the relationship between Stewie and his mother with a tenderness that was new and in its own way quite moving. Road to Rupert was one of the finest Road to episodes in the series. Barely Legal, in which Meg develops a crush on Brian after he takes her to prom out of pity, was a sharp piece of character comedy that showed exactly what the writing staff was capable of when it committed to story. But the mistreatment of Meg was becoming more intense. The show had discovered that making Meg the target of jokes generated a reliable audience response, and it was beginning to go to that well with increasing frequency. The nature of the jokes was shifting as well, moving from jokes about Meg's relative unremarkableness to jokes about her physical appearance, her unlikability, her complete undesirability to everyone around her. The shift from one type of cruelty to another is important. Jokes about being boring have a certain lightness because boredom is circumstantial and changeable. Jokes about being fundamentally unwanted are something else. These 2 seasons, 4 and 5, are the place where the show's original promise began to show its first genuine cracks. The talent was still largely there. The best episodes could still reach the heights the early seasons had reached. But something in the foundation was shifting, in ways that would not be fully visible until later. The character changes in Season 4 extended beyond Stewie. The treatment of Peter Griffin was beginning to edge towards something that would take years to fully register as a fundamental transformation. In Seasons 1 through 3, Peter's disasters were the disasters of a man who consistently failed to think things through, who acted on impulse and enthusiasm, and then was surprised when the results were not what his enthusiasm had promised. This was a recognizable form of stupidity. It was the stupidity of optimism, of someone who genuinely believed that each new scheme would work out, who had an infinite capacity for unfounded confidence and a short memory for the previous scheme's failure. Starting in Season 4, the texture of Peter's mistakes began to change. Small changes, easy to dismiss episode by episode, but accumulating into something different. There were moments where Peter's behavior could not quite be explained by stupidity alone, moments that required something closer to genuine indifference to the well-being of the people around him. He would do something harmful and react to the harm with an equanimity that the early Peter would not have had. He would hurt someone he loved, and the hurt would register less in his face and his behavior than it would have registered in the early seasons. These moments were minority notes in Seasons 4 and 5. They were surrounded by enough of the original Peter that they did not change the overall character of his depiction. But they were there, establishing a precedent, introducing a version of Peter that was slightly harder and slightly less caring than the version that had won the audience over in the first 3 seasons. And over the next 15 seasons, that slightly harder version would be the one the show increasingly inhabited. The humor in Season 4 was also shifting in its register. The early show's comedy had a particular relationship to darkness. It went to uncomfortable places, but did so with intelligence, with a punchline or a twist or a layer of irony that transformed the discomfort into something you could laugh at rather than simply cringe from. The darkness was purposeful. It served the joke. By Season 4, more of the humor was beginning to operate on shock alone. The discomfort was the point rather than the vehicle. This is a subtle but significant difference, and it is one that tends to compound over time. Once you have established that discomfort as endpoint is an acceptable comedic mode, the pressure to produce discomfort that registers grows with each subsequent episode because the audience becomes gradually immunized to each previous level, and the next level has to go further to achieve the same effect. Season 4 was also the year in which the show began to develop what would become one of its most persistent and most discussed qualities: the inconsistency of its central characters from episode to episode. In the early seasons, the Griffin family members had stable psychological profiles. They behaved in recognizable ways across different episodes. You could predict, with reasonable confidence, how Peter would respond to a given situation, how Lois would manage a particular crisis, how Brian would approach a specific problem. This predictability was not monotony. The situations were varied enough that consistent character traits could produce fresh comedy in each new context. It was the predictability of knowing a real person, of understanding how they think. By Season 4, this consistency was beginning to erode. Characters would behave in ways that were inconsistent with their established profiles, not because they had genuinely changed or developed, but because the episode required something different from them. Peter might be more compassionate in one episode and more cruel in the next, not because something had happened to shift his character, but because different writers had different takes on who he was, and those takes were not always reconciled. Lois might be sharp and funny in one episode, and passive and distant in another for no apparent reason. This inconsistency is one of the quieter costs of the staff turnover that MacFarlane had identified as a recurring problem. When the writers who built the characters are not consistently present, and when new writers are working from their own understanding of who the characters are, rather than from the shared institutional knowledge of people who were there when the characters were created, the characters become slightly different things in different writers' hands. Individually, the differences are small enough to dismiss. Cumulatively, they add up to characters who feel less like real people and more like character designs into which different personalities are loaded depending on what any given episode needs. Section 5. The Long Slow Drift Seasons 6 through 10. If Seasons 4 and 5 were the point where cracks first appeared, Seasons 6 through 10 are the period when those cracks grew wide enough to see clearly, even as the show continued to produce individual episodes that reminded you what it could be at its best. Season 6 premiered on the 23rd of September 2007 into a television landscape that was about to be significantly disrupted. The season started strongly. 2 episodes in particular stand out as among the most ambitious things Family Guy attempted during its entire run. Stewie Kills Lois and its sequel, Lois Kills Stewie, were a 2-part event that aired during Season 6 and represented a genuine creative swinging for the fences. The premise was exactly what it sounds like. Stewie finally, after 6 seasons of plotting and failure, actually follows through on his primary objective. He shoots Lois on a cruise ship. She falls overboard. She is presumed dead. The show played this completely seriously. There were no jokes cushioning the moment, no immediate deflation of the tension through comedy. Lois appeared to be dead. The Griffin family was in genuine grief. And Stewie's response to having achieved his lifelong goal was complex and unexpected, not triumphant, but strangely hollow, as though the thing he had wanted so badly had turned out to mean less once he had it than it had meant in the pursuit. The second part continued in equally elevated dramatic territory. Lois returned, having survived and become a hardened version of herself, and confronted Stewie. The climax of the 2-parter, in which the show delivered on years of built-up tension between these 2 characters, was by almost any measure the most cinematically ambitious sequence Family Guy had produced. And then came the twist. Everything that had just happened was revealed to be a simulation on Stewie's computer. A virtual reality scenario he had been running to see how things would play out. None of it had actually happened. The status quo was restored completely. This twist was clever in the moment. It solved the narrative problem of having actually killed a major character and having Stewie actually succeed in his defining goal. It was a solution that served the show's need to continue in its established format. But it also said something revealing about where Family Guy's creative philosophy was headed. The show was becoming increasingly reluctant to let its stories mean anything. Big things could happen. Dramatic events could unfold. But they would always be contained, always reset, always return to exactly where they had been before the episode started. This refusal to commit to consequences, which would become more extreme in later seasons, is one of the central reasons the show lost the sense of stakes that made its early seasons feel like there was something real happening. If nothing ever actually changes, and if the audience gradually learns that nothing ever actually changes, the investment that makes television drama and comedy work begins to erode. You stop caring what happens because you know the answer. The answer is always nothing that lasts. In November of 2007, the Writers Guild of America went on strike. This was a major labor action that disrupted nearly every scripted show on American television and left lasting marks on the industry. The strike was about residuals, about ensuring that writers would be paid for the use of their work in emerging digital distribution platforms, as streaming and online video were beginning to transform the ways television content was consumed and monetized. The Guild walked out on November 5th and did not return to work until the 12th of February 2008, a period of about 3 months. McFarlane was a vocal and visible supporter of the strike. He had been an advocate for the WGA during previous labor disputes, and he did not change that position now. He joined the picket lines. He made his support publicly known, but Fox aired 3 completed Family Guy episodes during the strike, without McFarlane's permission episodes that had been finished before the walkout began, which Fox technically had the right to broadcast, but which airing over the show's creators' objections created exactly the kind of bad feeling that tends to linger. The strike disrupted the creative rhythm of the show in ways that are difficult to quantify, but that were felt in the work. Television writing is a continuous, collaborative process. Stories are developed over weeks and months. Writers build on each other's ideas, push material through successive drafts, develop a collective understanding of what an episode needs to be. When that process stops for 3 months and then restarts, the momentum that had been building is gone. The connections between what had been worked on before the strike and what would be worked on after it required reconstruction. Some things that had been evolving naturally in the writing had to be rediscovered rather than simply continued. Season 7 aired from 2008 to 2009 and represented a clearer departure from the show's early character than anything that had come before. Peter's Flanderization, the process by which a character's most extreme traits gradually overpower everything else until those traits are all that remains, was now well underway. The loving father who happened to be foolish was giving way to something harder and stranger, a character whose selfishness and recklessness no longer felt like the comedy of a good person who keeps getting things wrong, but something more like genuine indifference to the people around him. The humor was leaning harder on shock value. Jokes about violence were getting more graphic. Cutaways were getting longer. The tendency to drag jokes past their natural endpoint, to run a gag for 30 or 40 seconds, when 10 seconds was all it needed, was becoming a pattern rather than an occasional experiment. But the show was also doing something interesting during this period that often gets lost in discussions of its decline. It was producing remarkable individual episodes while the larger architecture fell apart. The Brian and Stewie episodes remained consistently strong. And then there were fewer. The Season 9 premiere was a full-episode murder mystery parody featuring the entire regular cast and most of the recurring characters, directed with a visual style and sustained commitment that the show rarely matched. Road to the Multiverse, the Season 8 premiere, was one of the finest episodes the show ever made. A tour of alternate realities that used each alternate universe as an occasion for a different animation style, including a breathtaking sequence animated in the style of a Disney musical and another done in the crude, deliberately blocky style of the Family Guy video game. These episodes proved that the talent had not disappeared. The capacity for excellence had not gone away. What was happening was that the excellence was becoming intermittent and exceptional rather than steady and reliable. The baseline had dropped while the ceiling remained roughly where it had always been, creating a show that was capable of brilliance on specific occasions, but that had to be approached with different expectations than the early seasons warranted. The Meg situation was by this point no longer subtle. The treatment of the character had become a defining feature of the show in a way that many viewers found increasingly uncomfortable to watch. Peter's comments about his own daughter had moved from the realm of oblivious insensitivity into something that required a different vocabulary to describe. He would make jokes about wishing she would go away. He would humiliate her in front of strangers. Physical harm directed at Meg, played for laughs, was appearing with increasing frequency. What is strangest about this period is not that the cruelty was happening, but that the show was sometimes aware of it. There were episodes where the writing acknowledged explicitly that Meg was being treated terribly. A Season 8 episode called Peter's Daughter had Peter briefly become more attentive and caring toward Meg after she fell into a coma, only to revert to his previous behavior the moment she recovered. The episode understood its own joke. It knew that Peter's improved behavior was temporary and conditional. But understanding the joke and choosing not to continue the improvement are different things, and the show consistently chose the latter. The Season 10 episode Seahorse Seashell Party is the most discussed example of this dynamic, and it deserves extended attention when we reach the sections of this script specifically dedicated to character. For now, it is enough to note that by Seasons 8 through 10, the mistreatment of Meg had crossed from being a running joke into something that a significant portion of the audience was finding genuinely difficult to sit with. Stewie's transformation was largely complete by this period. The evil genius baby was effectively gone, replaced by a character who was emotionally curious and relationally complex, but who had shed the dangerous energy that had made him unforgettable. Occasional callbacks to his original characterization appeared moments where the old Stewie surfaced, usually in episodes where Stewie was isolated from his domestic routine in some way, but they had the quality of nostalgia rather than continuation. Brian, meanwhile, was on a trajectory that we will examine in full later. The shift in his characterization was gradual, but accumulated quickly. The intelligent, witty, loyal voice of reason was developing qualities that made him less easy to root for. His politics were taking up more of his personality. His relationships with women were becoming a source of unflattering characterization. The arrogance that had always been a background note in his character was getting louder. All of these changes were happening simultaneously, reinforcing each other, creating a show that was measurably different from what it had been a decade earlier. The audience was noticing. The ratings reflected it not in a sudden crash, but in a gradual, steady decline that was unmistakable when you mapped it across multiple seasons. And still the show continued. Still, there were moments of genuine brilliance. Still, the voice cast was performing at the highest level. Still, occasionally, an episode arrived that reminded you of what Family Guy had once been and could still be, briefly, when everything aligned. Section 6. The Problem of Stewie Griffin. Losing the Evil Genius. There is an argument that the writing staff of Family Guy would make, and have made, about the evolution of Stewie Griffin. The argument goes roughly like this. The evil baby concept was a one-note joke. It was clever and it was original, but it had a limited amount of comic territory to explore. You could only do so many variations on a baby plotting world domination before the concept exhausted itself. By choosing to develop Stewie into a more emotionally complex character, the writers gave him longevity and range that the original concept could never have sustained. This argument is not without merit, and it is worth engaging with seriously before explaining why the counter-argument is equally strong. The softer, more emotionally present Stewie that emerged from Season 4 onward genuinely had things to offer. His friendship with Brian produced some of the most emotionally resonant episodes the show ever made. The Season 12 episode Christmas Guy, in which Stewie uses a borrowed time machine to go back and prevent Brian's death, is a genuinely moving piece of television. The love between the two characters is earned and specific and real in the way that the best television relationships feel real. Stewie's grief over Brian's loss and his determination to undo it, and the particular detail that saving Brian means Stewie cannot keep the time machine, cannot go back to his future self, will be stranded in a past that will never return him to where he came from, is structurally elegant and emotionally effective. The newer Stewie could also carry storylines about identity and belonging and the specific loneliness of being too smart for the social world you find yourself in. His status as the most intelligent member of a family that does not really know, it possesses him that treats him as a baby while he exists as something categorically different, was a source of comedy that the show found in multiple configurations. The outsider-looking-in dynamic between Stewie and the family he could never quite make see him clearly had genuine pathos when the show chose to develop it rather than simply play it for quick laughs. All of this is real. The newer Stewie had real strengths. And yet, the evil genius baby was one of the most genuinely original character concepts in the history of American animation. Think about what that means carefully. Not most original of its decade, or most original on broadcast television, or most original in its genre. One of the most genuinely original period. The concept of the hyper-articulate, weaponized infant who exists as a fully formed malevolent intelligence inside the body of a one-year-old and who is completely invisible to the world around him. That is a character concept you could not find anywhere else. It had no real antecedent and has had no real successor. The tragedy of early Stewie is not just that he was funny. It is that he was irreplaceable. There were other characters on television who were insecure and searching for identity and emotionally complex. There were other odd couple pairings where two mismatched personalities found genuine affection for each other. These are well-populated genres of character storytelling with hundreds of examples across dozens of shows. There was only one evil genius baby. The argument that the concept had been exhausted does not hold up against the evidence of how long the show ran after abandoning it. Family Guy has produced far more episodes with the newer, softer Stewie than it ever produced with the evil genius. If there was enough material in the gentler version to sustain the character for 15 or more additional seasons, the idea that there was not enough material in the original concept to have continued it or evolved it in directions that built on, rather than discarded its essential nature, is simply not credible. Think about what the evil genius baby concept could have become if it had been developed rather than retired. Stewie's intelligence could have evolved into genuine power rather than remaining at the level of a very clever preschooler with good engineering skills. His relationship with the wider world, with other children, with the school system, with adults who encountered him and either understood or failed to understand what they were dealing with, had vast, untapped comic potential. The original tension between his ambitions and his physical limitations as an infant, which the early seasons only scratched the surface of, could have been a source of comedy for many more seasons. The decision to retire evil Stewie was presented as a creative decision, as the writers choosing to take the character somewhere more interesting rather than repeating themselves. But it is worth considering whether it was more accurately a failure of imagination. Whether the writers, faced with the challenge of finding new things to do with a genuinely difficult and specific character concept, took the easier path of replacing him with a character type they understood better. The Season 6 two-parter, Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie, functioned, whatever its narrative intentions, as a kind of unofficial farewell to the original Stewie. It gave him his victory, or appeared to. It let him do the thing he had always said he wanted to do, and then it undid it. And after that undoing, the world domination plots never really returned in any sustained way. The attempts on Lois's life, which had been a near-weekly feature of the early seasons, faded to rare exceptions. The weapons and machines and elaborate schemes gave way to emotional storylines and identity explorations. Some of this transition was managed skillfully. The Road 2 episodes remained strong through this period because the writers were genuinely good at writing the Brian and Stewie dynamic. Send in Stewie, Please, a Season 15 episode that placed Stewie in a therapy session for an entire episode and let MacFarlane show the full emotional range of the character in a relatively stripped-down format, was one of the finest episodes the show produced in its later years. These moments showed that something worth watching had emerged from the transition, even if what had been lost was irreplaceable. But in the aggregate, Family Guy after the soft Stewie transition was a less original show than it had been before. The character that made it like nothing else on television had been replaced by a character that was appealing and well-written, but that did not make Family Guy singular. Any number of shows could have had an emotionally complex, relationship-oriented character whose growth formed the heart of the series. Only Family Guy had a baby who talked like a villain and built ray guns in his nursery. The soft Stewie is perfectly pleasant. He is often funny. He has genuine warmth. He just doesn't make you feel the way the original did, that particular combination of hilarity and mild alarm that comes from watching something that should not work, working completely. The specific experience of watching Stewie in the later seasons and comparing him to early Stewie is one of the more genuinely poignant things in Family Guy's story, because the comparison requires holding two different versions of the same character in mind simultaneously. The physical presentation is the same: the yellow shirt, the football-shaped head, the distinctive accent that MacFarlane maintained with perfect consistency across every season. The voice is the same voice. The vocabulary has much of the same texture, but the interior life that the voice and the appearance contain is fundamentally different. Early Stewie watching Lois prepare dinner from across the kitchen, calmly narrating his plans for her elimination while she stirs whatever is on the stove and speaks to him in the particular cadence of a mother addressing an infant, that Stewie carried an extraordinary charge of energy. You were watching a character who existed simultaneously on two incompatible planes, and the comedy arose from both planes being equally real, equally present, equally committed to. The show believed in its own premise completely, and that total commitment was what made the premise work. Later, Stewie watching Brian from across whatever room they were sharing, processing some emotion that had arisen from their friendship or from a situation involving their relationships, that Stewie was pleasant and well-written and genuinely funny in individual moments, but the charge was different. The charge was the charge of a well-executed character, rather than the charge of something genuinely original. You were watching competent television. You had once been watching something you could not find anywhere else. The question of whether this transformation was worth making is one that does not have a clean answer, because the later Stewie brought things that the earlier Stewie could not have provided. But the question of whether it was necessary, whether the original concept had actually exhausted its possibilities, remains genuinely open. The writers' own evidence, in the form of the decades of additional seasons they produced with the softer version of the character, argues against the claim that there was nothing left to do with the evil genius baby. If the later Stewie could generate 15 or more seasons of material, the original Stewie, had the writers committed to developing him rather than retiring him, could surely have generated many seasons of material as well. The Stewie spin-off announcement in 2026 added a new dimension to this conversation. The spin-off's premise, Stewie expelled from his preschool and forced into adventures through space and time using his inventions, was a partial return to the adventure and gadget mode of the original character. The preschool setting placed Stewie among peers for the first time in a sustained way, which created genuinely new story territory. A social environment that Stewie was dramatically overqualified for, in which his intelligence made him not powerful but isolated, was a rich comic premise. Whether the spin-off would recover the specific charge of the original evil genius concept was a question that remained unanswered as of this writing, the project being some time from its premiere. McFarlane's commitment to voice the character provided continuity. Kirker Butler's deep knowledge of the Family Guy world provided experience. The two-season commitment from Fox suggested genuine faith in the project. But the history of Family Guy contains many examples of good intentions and genuine talent failing to produce the thing that the original had been, and the spin-off would have to navigate that history carefully. Section 7. The Tragedy of Brian Griffin. If the evolution of Stewie is a story about an original character being replaced by a less original but still functional one, the evolution of Brian Griffin is something harder to describe with equanimity. Because Brian's trajectory over the course of the show is not a story of replacement, it is a story of corruption. The Brian Griffin of seasons 1 through 3 was, as we have already established, close to a perfect realization of his character concept. Smart, witty, loyal, flawed in ways that felt human and recognizable. A failed writer who was capable enough to know he was failing and honest enough with himself to know why. A drinker who was not quite an alcoholic, but was clearly using alcohol to manage a level of dissatisfaction with his own life that he could not directly address. A romantic who kept falling for the wrong people because the right one was not available to him in the way he wanted. He was the character you could actually identify with in a show where almost everyone else was too extreme to identify with directly. Peter was too stupid. Stewie was too brilliant and too villainous. Lois was too patient and competent. Brian was at the right distance from the audience, smart enough to be admirable, flawed enough to be recognizable, honest enough to be trustworthy. His relationship with Peter worked because he genuinely cared about Peter. Not despite Peter's stupidity, not in spite of Peter's constant disasters, but somehow because of them in the way that loyal friendship sometimes works, because being needed by someone who trusts you completely, even if that someone keeps getting both of you into catastrophic situations, is its own form of value. The first signs of what Brian would become arrived in seasons 4 and 5, when his political views began to take up more of his available screen time. Brian had always had opinions. He had always been politically liberal, openly atheist, vocal about social issues. But in the early seasons, these opinions were one ingredient among many in a character who had several dimensions. His politics were part of who he was rather than the entirety of who he was. Starting with the revival, the politics began to crowd out the other dimensions. Scenes that existed primarily to allow Brian to deliver a position on a current issue started appearing with increasing frequency. These scenes had a different quality from Brian as character scenes. In a Brian as character scene, whatever he said emerged organically from the situation and from his relationship to the people around him. In a Brian as mouthpiece scene, the situation existed to set up what he was going to say, and what he was going to say had been written to communicate the writer's position rather than to deepen Brian as a person. This distinction matters enormously. A character who has opinions is interesting. A character who exists to express opinions is not a character anymore, they are a function. Brian was slowly becoming a function. But the political flattening was only the beginning of the damage. What happened to Brian's fundamental characterization, his honesty, his loyalty, his care for the people around him, was more devastating than the soapboxing. The show began giving Brian storylines in which he behaved in ways that the Brian of seasons 1 through 3 would simply not have behaved. He treated women with a shallow acquisitiveness that was completely at odds with the romantic idealism of the early character. He treated Stewie, his closest friend and the being who loved him most unconditionally in the world, with contempt and cruelty that had no grounding in anything established about who Brian was. He neglected responsibilities, failed people who depended on him, and faced consequences for almost none of it. The Brian Writes a Bestseller episode from season 9, often pointed to by fans as a watershed moment in Brian's decline, depicted him becoming grotesquely arrogant after the commercial success of a self-help book he had written and taking that arrogance out specifically on Stewie, who had encouraged him to write the book in the first place. The betrayal of the person who believed in him, for no real reason other than the intoxication of sudden success, was not written as a moment of character failure that Brian would reckon with. It was played as comedy. Brian's cruelty to Stewie was the joke. The Quagmire speech from Season 8 deserves its own discussion, both because of how good it is as a piece of writing and because of what the show chose to do after it. In the Season 8 episode, Jerome is the new Black. Quagmire, whose own moral character in the show is somewhere between complicated and genuinely problematic, and who is nobody's idea of a reliable moral arbiter, delivers a speech to Brian that lays out, with extraordinary specificity and accuracy, every problematic aspect of who Brian had become. He calls Brian a phony intellectual. He calls him out for hitting on Lois in front of her husband. He identifies the gap between Brian's stated values and his actual behavior. He notes that Brian abandoned a son without apparent remorse. He calls out the pretension and the performance and the fundamental dishonesty of the persona Brian has been presenting. Everything Quagmire says in this speech is verifiably true based on what the show has depicted. And the speech is well written. It is sharp and specific and delivered with conviction. It is clearly written by writers who understood exactly what Brian had become and were using Quagmire to say it directly. What makes the speech so strange is what happens afterward. The show clearly intended for the audience to understand that Brian's problem had been identified and named, and then it did nothing about it. Brian did not change. Brian did not wrestle with what Quagmire had said. Brian continued to be the version of himself that Quagmire had just eviscerated, in many cases worse than before, and the show continued to present him without any meaningful consequences or growth. It is almost as though the writers thought that having a character say the thing was equivalent to the show doing the thing, that having Quagmire identify Brian's failures meant that the show had addressed those failures without actually having Brian address them. Then came the death and the resurrection. In Season 12's Life of Brian, Brian was hit by a car and died. The show treated the death with an unusual level of emotional seriousness. The Griffin family's grief was depicted with more care than the show usually brought to emotional content, and the absence of Brian from the family dynamic was felt in the episode. A new dog named Vinny, voiced by Tony Sirico in one of his last major roles before his own death years later, was introduced as a potential replacement. Fans reacted with an intensity that surprised the people making the show. Seth MacFarlane later said in a Reddit AMA that the size of the reaction caught them off guard. More than 100,000 people signed a Change.org petition demanding Brian's return. The hashtag #BringingBrianBack trended nationally on Twitter. The death was covered as news in major media outlets. The show had not intended for the death to be permanent. The resurrection was planned, but the window between the death and the revival, just 2 episodes, was short enough that many fans interpreted the resurrection as the show backing down in response to pressure rather than executing a planned story. The resurrection, through a time travel device Stewie borrowed from his future self, was emotionally effective in the Christmas Guy episode. The scene where Stewie, still grieving, encounters his alternate timeline self and persuades that self to lend him the time machine so he can save Brian, and where the alternate Stewie, understanding what this means about his friendship with Brian, agrees is one of the show's genuinely tender moments. But the larger effect of the death and resurrection arc was to confirm something the more critical segment of the audience had been feeling for a while, that nothing in Family Guy was permanent, that dramatic gestures were ultimately decorative rather than consequential, and that the show would always return to its established patterns regardless of what it appeared to commit to in any given episode. After the resurrection, Brian somehow got worse. The traits that had made him insufferable were amplified. The occasions on which he behaved with genuine generosity or care became rarer. The show seemed to have learned from the passionate reaction to Brian's death that the audience cared about him, but interpreted that caring as license to keep doing exactly what it had been doing with him, rather than as an incentive to bring back the version of Brian the audience had actually been mourning. There is a cruelty specific to watching someone become a worse version of themselves over time while still being recognizably the person you originally cared about. The early Brian is still there, in certain moments in quiet conversations with Stewie, in rare episodes where the writing makes the effort to find the original character underneath all the accumulated damage. And those moments are genuinely painful, not in a satisfying way, but in the way of seeing the outline of something that used to be whole. Section 7.5. Meg Griffin and the joke that ate a character. Meg Griffin deserves a section of her own in this story, because what happened to her character over the course of the show's run is distinct from what happened to Peter, or Brian, or Stewie in ways that matter. Those characters were flanderized, reduced to their most extreme traits, hollowed out until their original depth was replaced by caricature. What happened to Meg was different. Meg was not flanderized. She was used? She was used as a resource. The writers discovered, at some point around season 4 or 5, that making Meg the target of increasingly extreme cruelty generated a reliable audience response. It worked as comedy in the immediate sense. Audiences laughed, the jokes landed, the episodes tested well, and so the writers kept doing it, and kept escalating it. Because escalation is what you do when a comedic resource is producing returns. You increase the input to maintain the output. Each season, the cruelty toward Meg increased incrementally. Each season, the baseline moved. By seasons 8 through 12, the treatment of Meg had become genuinely difficult to watch for a significant portion of the show's audience, not because they were squeamish about dark comedy, but because the comedy was no longer doing any work. The jokes about Meg's appearance, her undesirability, her worthlessness to her own family, were not satirizing anything or illuminating anything. They were simply asserting that Meg was ugly and unwanted and that this was funny. Repeating this assertion hundreds of times across hundreds of episodes did not make it funnier. It made it something else. The season 10 episode Seahorse Seashell Party is the episode that crystallized everything wrong with what the show was doing with Meg, and it is worth examining in enough detail to understand why it generated such strong and sustained negative reaction from fans and critics. The episode's premise placed the Griffin family trapped together in their house during a hurricane. Meg, after years of accumulated abuse in the show's chronology, and after years of accumulated frustration in the audience's experience of watching it, finally reaches a breaking point. She confronts her family. She tells them exactly what their treatment of her has cost her. She is articulate and specific and entirely right about everything she says. She calls Peter a terrible father, which he has been. She calls Lois a bad mother, which she has been. She describes the specific ways their contempt has shaped her self-image and her capacity for happiness. It is one of the most emotionally honest speeches the show produced in any of its later seasons. For the portion of the audience that had been watching Meg absorb years of abuse and waiting for something to shift, this moment felt like justice. It felt like the show finally acknowledging that what it had been doing to this character was wrong, that she had been wronged, that she deserved better. It felt like a reckoning. And then the episode took a turn that its defenders described as clever, and its critics described as deeply troubling. With Meg no longer serving as the family's shared target, the rest of the Griffins turned on each other. The family dynamic collapsed in the absence of their common punching bag. And the episode ended with Meg going to Brian and voluntarily retracting everything she had said, agreeing to go back to being the target. Because without her absorbing the family's combined dysfunction, the family could not function. This ending was, and remains, one of the most discussed moments in Family Guy's history. The show's defenders argued that it was a psychologically astute commentary on family systems and the way dysfunction distributes itself, that Meg's role as scapegoat was a genuine structural feature of the Griffin family, rather than simply cruelty for its own sake. The show's critics argued that the ending communicated something deeply troubling, that victims of abuse should accept their role because their suffering serves a functional purpose for the people who abuse them. Both readings are available in the text. Both are defensible interpretations of what the episode chose to do, but what the episode definitely did was reset the situation. After the speech, after the reckoning, after the moment of justice that the audience had been waiting for, Meg went back to being the target. The reset button was hit, and in the episodes that followed, the abuse continued largely as before. This is the pattern that made the Meg storyline so frustrating across its decade-long escalation. The show demonstrating, in occasional episodes, that it knew how to write her as a genuine person with dignity and interiority, and then resetting to the default of contempt in the episodes that followed those demonstrations. The two steps forward, one step back dynamic, or more accurately, the one step forward, two steps back dynamic, was the same pattern that governed the show's treatment of all its characters, but it felt most pointed with Meg because the abuse that was being reset was most extreme with Meg. The real-world impact of the show's treatment of Meg Griffin, noted in various interviews with Mila Kunis over the years, was that people began addressing her with lines from the show, the dismissive catchphrase associated with Peter's treatment of Meg becoming something that real people said to the real woman who voiced the character. The fiction had influenced the way a real person was treated by real people. This is an unusual and troubling kind of cultural feedback loop, and the fact that it happened is a measure of how deeply the show's contempt for the character had penetrated the cultural understanding of what Meg Griffin was for. The improvement in Meg's treatment that began around season 14 or 15, credited by some to the addition of more women to the writing staff who pushed back against the sustained cruelty, was genuine. By season 22 or 23, the extreme abuse had largely stopped. Meg was getting storylines in which she was competent and tough, and even celebrated for specific qualities she had developed. She had not been fully rehabilitated as a character. Too much history had accumulated. Too many episodes of contempt had established a baseline that could not be fully corrected, but she had been improved. The damage done to her over those 10 seasons of systematic abuse was, in its own way, a kind of landmark. Not a landmark of quality, but a landmark of what happens when a show loses sight of its own characters as people and begins treating them as resources to be exploited for comedic efficiency. Meg Griffin was a person in seasons 1 through 3. She became a function. She is somewhere between those two things in the most recent seasons. The show should have kept her a person all along. Section 8. The cutaway problem and the comedy of shock. Every artistic format has tools. The cutaway gag was Family Guy's defining tool, the mechanism that set it apart from every other animated comedy on television, the formal choice that made it identifiable at a glance, even if you had never seen the show before. If someone who had never encountered Family Guy described what they knew about it, they would almost certainly describe the cutaway gags. A character says something that prompts a comparison or a reference. The screen cuts to a visual illustration of that reference. The joke plays out. The show returns to the scene. Repeat. This is the show's signature. It is what the show is most associated with in popular understanding, more than any specific character or storyline. In its original form, the cutaway gag was used with precision and restraint that its later deployment made easy to forget. The early seasons treated cutaways as punctuation brief, bright interruptions that added something to a scene without displacing it. They were short. Most of them were over in 10 to 15 seconds. They made their joke and departed without leaving any structural damage behind. The main plots of early episodes existed independently of the cutaways and would have been comprehensible without them. You could watch an episode from season 2 with every cutaway removed and still have a complete story with a beginning, middle, and end, with characters doing things for reasons that made sense, with some kind of emotional arc running through it. The cutaways enhanced the experience of watching, but they did not constitute it. This is not true of many later episodes. By the middle and late seasons, the cutaway had metastasized into the primary mechanism of many episodes. The main story existed as connective tissue between cutaway gags rather than as a story that cutaway gags enhanced. If you remove the cutaways from a typical season 15 or season 18 episode, you would be left with something closer to an outline than a plot events, connected by implication rather than scene, characters whose relationships to each other existed more in the cultural memory of the show than in anything the episode itself demonstrated. South Park's 2006 two-parter Cartoon Wars addressed this directly and with genuine sharpness. Trey Parker and Matt Stone depicted Family Guy's writing process as a room full of manatees randomly pushing idea balls together. The joke being that the cutaways were not actually connected to anything, that you could replace any one of them with any other, and the episode would be exactly as coherent. This was satire, but it was satire from a position of genuine criticism, and it came with the additional information that The Simpsons and King of the Hill writers reportedly called Parker and Stone to thank them for making those episodes. The criticism was not entirely fair in 2006, but it became more fair with every passing season. The Conway Twitty gag is the extreme example that crystallized everything the cutaway dependency had become. In multiple episodes across multiple seasons, when a cutaway was called for, the show simply cut to an unedited performance by country singer Conway Twitty, a full song. Not a brief clip, not a parody, just Conway Twitty singing one of his songs. The first time this happened, there was a genuine argument to be made that it was funny precisely because it was so absurdly committed to withholding the joke. The audience expected a punchline, and the show refused to provide one, and the refusal was itself a kind of statement. But the gag recurred, multiple times, across multiple seasons. By the third or fourth iteration, it was not a bold comedic choice or a clever deconstruction of the gag format. It was a placeholder. It was the show saying, in the most direct way possible, that it did not have a joke for this moment, and had decided to fill the space with several minutes of an unrelated country music performance rather than write a new one. The impulse to drag jokes out beyond their natural endpoint arrived at roughly the same time as the cutaway dependency and was related to it. Both problems shared a root cause. The show was producing more content than it could consistently fill with quality material, and it was using formal tricks, the extended gag, the repeated cutaway, to occupy time that actual writing would otherwise have needed to occupy. A joke that lasts 5 seconds and lands cleanly is a better joke than the same joke stretched to 45 seconds. This is not debatable. Timing is fundamental to comedy, and timing requires knowing when to stop. The early Family Guy understood this instinctively. The later Family Guy seemed to have lost the instinct, or possibly the incentive, since longer gags occupy more of a 22-minute episode and reduce the amount of fresh material you need to generate per episode. The shift towards shock value as a primary humor mechanism was related to but distinct from the cutaway problem. Shock humor is the kind of comedy where the thing being depicted is so extreme or disturbing or transgressive that the audience's reaction to seeing it is itself the joke. The early Family Guy used shock as one comedic tool among many a spike of extremity in the middle of something more measured, arriving when the setup had earned it. The later Family Guy leaned on shock as a default setting. The violence in the show became more graphic as the seasons accumulated. Where the early seasons had the cartoon violence of a Looney Tunes short, exaggerated, consequence-free, physically impossible, clearly operating in a symbolic rather than realistic register, the later seasons pushed towards something more visceral. Injuries were depicted with a level of visual detail that seemed designed to produce discomfort rather than laughter. The kind of gross-out humor that works when it is brief and unexpected was held on screen for extended durations that remove the surprise that makes that kind of humor function. There is an important distinction between dark humor and shock for its own sake that the show's critics correctly identified, and that the show itself sometimes seemed not to understand. Dark humor requires intelligence behind it. It takes something uncomfortable and finds a way to make it meaningful to say something true or surprising through the vehicle of the discomfort. Shock for its own sake just shows you something extreme and expects the extremity to generate a reaction. The first approach requires skill, the second does not. The early Family Guy made dark jokes about subjects that genuinely merited dark humor. It satirized institutions and behaviors that deserved to be punctured. It used comedy to say things about American culture that could not have been said as effectively any other way. The later Family Guy often just showed you something awful and waited for you to laugh. What is most damaging about the shift toward shock value, viewed in retrospect, is that it was completely unnecessary. The show demonstrated repeatedly that it was capable of intelligent, well-constructed comedy that did not rely on extremity or transgression for its effect. The Brian and Stewie Vault episode is the clearest evidence of this, an entire episode that contains no cutaways, no shock, no violence, no transgression, and is nevertheless one of the most purely watchable episodes the show ever produced, simply because it features two well-written characters having an honest conversation in an unusual situation. When Family Guy chose to be good at the specific things it had always been genuinely good at, it was still excellent. The tragedy of the shock value trend is not that it corrupted the show's ability to be good, that ability remained, but that it replaced the exercise of that ability with something cheaper and louder that required less effort and generated less lasting satisfaction. Section 9. Where did Seth go? The creator steps back. Around 2011, Seth MacFarlane made a decision that would have lasting consequences for Family Guy in ways that were not immediately obvious from the outside. He stepped back from active, creative involvement in the show. He did not quit. He did not abandon the project. He continued to voice all four of his regular characters, Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire, reading every script that was produced and occasionally providing notes. His presence was felt in the building in certain ways. Showrunner Richard Apple said publicly that MacFarlane reads every script and sometimes has strong enough reactions to throw out material he considers substandard, suggesting that his quality control function had not entirely disappeared. But the day-to-day work of the writing room, the story planning sessions, the episodic creative oversight, all of that passed to other hands. Rich Appel and Alex Sulkin became the showrunners who actually ran Family Guy on a week-to-week basis. They were capable professionals with long histories in television and with real understanding of the show they were managing. But there is a difference between understanding a show from the inside and having created it from nothing, and that difference matters enormously when the challenges of keeping a long-running show alive require navigating territory that no rulebook can fully map. MacFarlane's departure from the creative driver's seat was not unilateral. It was driven by the other things in his life and career that were demanding his attention. In 2012, he wrote, directed, produced, and starred in Ted, a comedy feature film about a man whose childhood teddy bear came to life and maintained a complicated adult friendship with him. Ted was a massive commercial success. It earned more than $500 million worldwide and became one of the most successful rated comedies in the history of cinema. He followed Ted with A Million Ways to Die in the West in 2014, another feature film that he wrote, directed, and starred in, set in the American frontier and built around a comedic sensibility that drew heavily on his television work. Ted 2 arrived in 2015. In 2017, he created and starred in The Orville, a science fiction television series that began on Fox and later moved to Hulu, which represented in many ways his most ambitious and personally invested creative project, a show that wore its affection for classic science fiction clearly on its sleeve, and that MacFarlane pursued with a level of commitment that suggested it meant something to him beyond its commercial value. He was also a professional singer. He had released multiple albums of big band and jazz standards, a pursuit that was surprisingly well regarded by people who encountered it without preconceptions. He had hosted the Academy Awards. He was, by any measure, one of the busiest and most in-demand creative figures in Hollywood. Family Guy was the thing that had made him. It was the foundation of everything else he had built. But it was no longer, clearly, the thing he most wanted to be making. When he talked about the show in interviews during this period, he spoke about it with the particular affection and slight weariness of someone discussing a relationship that had been important and formative, but had passed its moment of greatest intensity. He cared about it. He did not want it to fail. But the burning creative investment that had characterized the early years was no longer the dominant note. His public relationship with Fox, the network that had canceled Family Guy twice and then brought it back and that continued to air it, became increasingly complicated as the years went on. MacFarlane is politically liberal in ways that are not particularly subtle and that are not particularly compatible with certain of the other content that Fox as a corporate entity has been associated with. In 2021, he posted publicly that Tucker Carlson's presence on the Fox News side of the company made him wish Family Guy was on any other network. He described his relationship with Fox as resembling a failing marriage. In 2020, he signed a major deal with NBC Universal, worth a reported $200 million over 5 years, which moved his production company, Fuzzy Door Productions, into a corporate relationship with an entirely different media entity. His newer projects, The Orville on Hulu, the Ted series for Peacock, were being made for platforms that had nothing to do with Fox. He was building his future elsewhere, while Family Guy remained the thing keeping him contractually connected to a network he had publicly expressed frustration with. This dynamic is strange and worth thinking about carefully. A show does not normally get made well when its creator is emotionally elsewhere. A writer does not normally produce their best work about people and places they have moved on from. The show that MacFarlane had made in 1999 came from somewhere from a specific set of preoccupations and enthusiasms and cultural observations that were genuinely his. The show that continued after his creative departure was being made by people who understood those preoccupations secondhand, who had inherited a vocabulary without having been present when the language was invented. The question of whether this matters, whether authorial intention and personal investment have detectable effects on creative output, is one of the more genuinely interesting questions you can ask about any long-running piece of entertainment. For Family Guy, the answer seems to be yes. The show before MacFarlane's substantive departure and the show after it are measurably different things, not in any specific change you can point to, but in the aggregate quality and texture of the work. In April of 2024, MacFarlane gave an interview in which he articulated his philosophy about the show's continuation in terms that were interesting for their honesty. He said he did not see a good reason to stop. He said people still loved it, it made people happy, it helped fund causes he cared about, specifically environmental conservation through the Rainforest Trust. He said the show had reached what he called escape velocity, had been going long enough that there was no logical reason to end it unless the audience stopped wanting it. What is notable about this articulation is what is absent from it. He did not talk about stories he wanted to tell. He did not talk about directions he was excited to take the characters. He did not talk about creative possibilities that made him eager to keep making it. He talked about continued existence, about maintaining something that had proven it could be maintained, about utility and function, which is a reasonable thing to say about a long-running show after 25 years and a full life built around other projects. But it is very different from the energy of someone who is making something because they have to, because the thing inside them that needs to make it is still insisting. The show continued. It continues now. It will continue through season 27 at minimum, under the terms of the April 2025 renewal deal that Fox called a Meganimation Agreement, a 4-season renewal alongside The Simpsons, Bob's Burgers, and The Returning American Dad, carrying the show through the 2028 to 2029 television season and coinciding with its 30th anniversary. 15 episodes per season on a Wednesday night in a slot that the show's original audience would have found nearly unrecognizable. Section 10. The paradox that won't resolve Family Guy's future. We have arrived at the part of the story where the title of this video finally becomes something more than a label. The Family Guy paradox is this. A show that has arguably been past its creative peak for 15 years, continues to be watched by millions of people every week, continues to be renewed for additional seasons, continues to generate genuine critical discussion about what it was and what it became, and continues to feel culturally alive in ways that many better shows do not. Simultaneously, that same show is watched by a fraction of its peak audience, has been moved from its flagship Sunday night slot to a Wednesday night, and is publicly discussed by its own creator primarily in terms of financial utility rather than creative necessity. How do you hold both of those things at once? What does it mean for a show to be, at the same time, important and diminished, beloved and disappointing, still present and somehow long gone? Let us start with the numbers, because the numbers tell a story that cannot be argued with. When Family Guy premiered on the 31st of January 1999, the first episode drew approximately 22 million viewers. This was an inflated number due to the Super Bowl lead-in, and everyone understood that. But even accounting for the Super Bowl effect, the first season averaged around 12 to 13 million households tuning in. For a new animated comedy, that was a serious performance. The revival in 2005 drew about 7.9 million average viewers in season 4, an impressive number for a show that had been off the air for 3 years, and a reflection of the passion that Adult Swim and DVD sales had generated in the intervening period. From that high point, the decline was gradual and steady. Season 13, which aired in 2014 and 2015, averaged 5.86 million viewers. Season 14 saw further decline. Season 20 averaged just 1.31 million viewers, with a 0.45 rating in the key adults, 18 to 49 demographic. Season 23 dropped to around 723,000 viewers, with a 0.19 rating in that same demographic. That is not a slow decline. That is a collapse. The show went from 7.9 million viewers at its revival peak to under a million in the space of roughly 19 seasons. It lost more than 85% of its broadcast audience. The move from Sunday nights to Wednesday nights, which began with the 2023 to 2024 season, was, in industry terms, an explicit acknowledgement of the show's diminished status within Fox's lineup. Sunday night is prestige real estate in American television. It is where you put your flagships, your anchors, your most reliable performers. Wednesday night is where you put things that you want to maintain without necessarily showcasing. Family Guy went from being the anchor of animation domination to being a Wednesday night companion piece. And yet, Family Guy ranked as the second most watched adult animation streaming title in 2025, according to Nielsen's streaming data. It charted on Nielsen's streaming top 10 for 37 weeks in 2025. Across Hulu, where the show's complete library is available, and on cable reruns, and on Comedy Central, and on FXX, and on Adult Swim, which brought the show back in early 2025 for the first time since 2021. Across all of these platforms simultaneously, Family Guy is being consumed by an enormous number of people. The viewership is not gone, it has changed form. The audience that used to sit in front of a television at 9 o'clock on Sunday night has migrated to platforms where they can watch the show on their own schedule, in fragments or in marathon sessions, alone or in a room full of people, on a phone, on a bus, or on a television in a bedroom at 2 in the morning. The experience of consuming Family Guy has been atomized in the way that streaming atomizes all television content, and in that atomized form it turns out to be extraordinarily durable. Part of the reason for this durability is the cutaway format that became such a subject of creative criticism. The cutaway gag, whatever its faults as a structural element of storytelling, produces content that is singularly well-suited to an era of short-form video consumption. A 30-second cutaway that is funny on its own terms, without requiring any context from the episode around it, is a piece of content that can travel. It can be clipped and shared and recommended and encountered completely without any relationship to the larger episode it came from. This is exactly what has happened on YouTube and TikTok and Instagram Reels and every other platform where short video clips circulate. Family Guy clips have billions of collective views across these platforms. The show's presence in internet culture is enormous in ways that its broadcast ratings entirely fail to capture. When you ask people whether they have seen Family Guy, essentially everyone in a certain age bracket says yes. When you ask whether they watch it regularly, fewer people say yes. When you ask whether they know specific cutaway gags, the recognition is almost universal. The show exists in popular consciousness in a particular way as a vast reservoir of reference points and quotable moments that functions almost like shared cultural vocabulary. People who stopped watching Family Guy years ago can still quote its jokes, still recognize its characters, still engage with its comedy on the level of individual moments, even if they have no investment in its current seasons. This is unusual. Most shows, when their cultural moment passes, recede into the background of general awareness rather than remaining as active reference points in daily conversation. The business logic of continuing to make Family Guy is therefore not difficult to follow. The show costs relatively little to produce. Animated shows have smaller budgets than live-action network dramas. Voice actors record their lines in booths without requiring expensive on-location productions. Animation is completed overseas in facilities that have been doing this work for decades. The overhead is modest compared to the revenue generated by streaming licensing deals, cable syndication arrangements, merchandise, and the ongoing exploitation of a library with over 460 episodes. The April 2025 renewal deal that Fox described as a Meganimation agreement, carrying the show through season 27 through the 2028 to 2029 season, coinciding with its 30th anniversary, makes complete sense as a business transaction, even if it raises questions as an artistic one. The show will cost less than many Fox originals to produce. It will generate reliable revenue through the Hulu streaming deal and through other distribution channels. It is a known quantity in a business where known quantities are genuinely valuable. And the announced Stewie spinoff, greenlit in March 2026 for a 2-season order set to premiere in 2027 to 2028, represents an extension of the brand into new territory. A bet that the world McFarlane built in 1999 still has unexplored commercial potential. The Stewie spinoff is an interesting development for reasons beyond its commercial logic. Its premise, Stewie expelled from his old preschool and forced to attend a new, lesser institution where he befriends a group of miserable kids and a 75-year-old class turtle with strong opinions, before using his inventions to take the group on adventures through space and time, is essentially a return to the adventure and gadget-based storytelling that Stewie's character was built around in the early seasons of The Parent Show. It is, in some ways, an acknowledgement that the Stewie Griffin who built ray guns and time machines was always a better engine for storytelling than the Stewie Griffin who processed his feelings in heart-to-heart conversations with Brian. Whether the spin-off will actually capture what made early Stewie great, or whether it will be a newer, gentler version of the character in a different setting, that remains to be seen. MacFarlane will voice the character. Kirker Butler, a longtime Family Guy writer who knows the show's DNA deeply, will serve as showrunner. The two-season commitment from Fox suggests genuine investment in making it work. And MacFarlane's own statement about the project dry and slightly self-deprecating, as his public statements tend to be at least suggest that he has not lost his capacity for ironic distance from the machine around him. The television industry's relationship with animated shows is worth understanding clearly because it helps explain why Family Guy continued to be renewed and continued to be made, even as its broadcast audience shrank to a fraction of its former size. Live-action television drama or comedy has a complex and expensive production structure. You need actors, you need sets, you need locations, you need the full apparatus of on-set production, with all the logistical and financial overhead that implies. A typical network drama might cost $3 to $5 million per episode. A prestige cable drama might cost $10 million or more. These numbers represent the minimum threshold below which you cannot produce quality live-action television, and they mean that a live-action show needs to generate substantial advertising revenue and audience numbers to justify its continued production. Animated shows, by contrast, are lean. The principal cost is human creativity writers and animators and voice actors rather than physical production apparatus. You do not build sets. You do not shoot on location. You do not pay the enormous ancillary costs of live production. The voice actors record in booths. The animation is produced overseas in studios that have been doing this for decades with established workflows, and the production process is fundamentally about people sitting at desks and computers rather than about organizing large crews in physical locations. The result is that an animated show can be produced for a fraction of what live-action programming costs, and that fraction means that the commercial threshold for renewed viability is correspondingly lower. Family Guy, at 600,000 broadcast viewers per episode, is still generating advertising revenue. It is still generating streaming revenue from Hulu, where it remains one of the most watched programs. It is still generating cable syndication revenue from FXX and Comedy Central and Adult Swim. It is still generating international licensing revenue from the dozens of countries where the show airs. It is still selling merchandise. The business of Family Guy at 600,000 broadcast viewers is still, by any sober analysis, a good business, because the production costs are modest enough that the revenue easily justifies them. This is why the April 2025 megadeal made complete economic sense for Fox and Disney, even at a moment when the show's broadcast ratings had declined to numbers that would have meant immediate cancellation for any live-action property. The deal was not about the Wednesday night audience. It was about the Hulu rights, the international rights, the streaming library, the merchandise, the brand value accumulated across 25 years of production. It was about the fact that Family Guy and American Dad and The Simpsons and Bob's Burgers together represented a stable, cost-effective, globally distributed animated entertainment portfolio that could be locked in for several years at a predictable cost and at a predictable return. This business model also explains why the show's creative decline, however visible and however extensively documented, did not translate into cancellation. The financial calculus of animated television is largely insulated from the kind of quality-based reckoning that affects live-action properties because the cost structure means that the show can remain commercially viable at audience numbers that would be unsustainable for more expensive productions. What this means for the question of Family Guy's future, which is to say, for the question of whether there is any realistic path by which the show might recover some of the qualities it lost, is perhaps the most interesting implication. A show that needs high ratings to survive is a show that is constantly being evaluated by something external. The pressure of that evaluation, however crude the metric, creates a kind of accountability. A show that can survive comfortably at low ratings is insulated from that accountability in ways that may not serve it creatively. Family Guy will continue to exist through the end of the decade regardless of whether its current creative direction improves or deteriorates. The Stewie spin-off will premiere in 2027, and its success or failure will have its own implications for the franchise's future. American Dad will rejoin Fox's animation domination block for the first time since 2014, which creates the genuinely interesting situation of the better and lesser version of the McFarlane animated universe sharing a broadcast network again for the first time in over a decade. What the next few seasons of Family Guy actually produce, whether they represent a continuation of the trends that characterize seasons 14 through 22, or whether the presence of a spin-off and the return of American Dad to the same network creates any kind of reflective pressure toward quality, is genuinely unknown. The conditions for something interesting are present. Whether anyone will make use of them is a separate question. Now consider American Dad alongside all of this. The show that launched in February of 2005, just months before Family Guy returned from its second cancellation. The show that was widely dismissed as a lesser copy, a satellite project from a creator whose real focus was obviously on his flagship. The show that nobody was calling better than Family Guy in 2005, or in 2006, or probably in 2007. And yet somewhere in the middle of all those years of Family Guy's slow decline, American Dad did something that the flagship never quite managed. It got consistently better. Not better in individual moments, not better in isolated brilliant episodes that reminded you what the show could do. Consistently, structurally, in its foundations and its character work, and its willingness to commit to stories, American Dad improved while Family Guy declined. The reasons for this are not mysterious. American Dad did not use cutaway gags. Without that structural crutch available, the writers were forced to make every episode work as a complete story. Every joke had to emerge from the characters and situations rather than from disconnected tangential references. This requirement produced better writers, or at least better writing habits. The discipline of needing your stories to actually function sharpens skills in ways that having a formal shortcut available does not. Stan Smith, the show's protagonist, started as a one-dimensional political caricature, a hyper-conservative CIA agent whose worldview was the punchline. But the writing staff allowed Stan to become a complete person over time. His stubbornness and his frequent wrongness coexisted with genuine love for his family and real capacity for growth. He had episodes where he was the hero and episodes where he was the villain, and both felt earned because the character had been developed enough to make both believable. Roger the Alien, the standout character whose capacity for adopting different personas gave the writers an effectively infinite well of material, became one of the most celebrated characters in American animated television precisely because the writers kept finding new ways to develop the concept rather than retiring it. Every persona was a new character with its own history and personality and set of comic possibilities. The format was built for long-term creative fertility in a way that none of Family Guy's original character concepts, except perhaps early Stewie, had been. American Dad maintained warmth in its family dynamic in ways that Family Guy did not. The Smith family, despite their many dysfunctions, felt like people who actually liked each other. Their conflicts were grounded in real character tensions, rather than in the show's need to generate cruelty for its own sake. Francine was treated with consistent respect as a character even through storylines that tested her. Haley and Steve had consistent personalities and relationships that built over time. Klaus the Fish served as a butt of jokes without the mistreatment ever taking on the quality of genuine contempt that Family Guy's treatment of Meg did. American Dad also handled its transition from Fox to TBS in 2014 gracefully, finding more creative freedom on cable and continuing to produce strong work. Its recent return to Fox, as part of the same April 2025 megadeal that renewed Family Guy and The Simpsons and Bob's Burgers, represents a genuine reunion rather than a survival exercise. What does the American Dad comparison prove? It proves that the decline of Family Guy was a choice. The existence of another show from the same creator, from the same cultural moment, with many of the same writers, that chose differently and ended up in a better creative place, that is not an argument for anything except choices. Both shows face the same fundamental challenge of maintaining creative quality across decades of continuous production. One met that challenge better than the other, not because of luck or circumstance, but because of the specific creative decisions made by the people in charge of making it. Family Guy's choices were the wrong ones, in aggregate over time. The choice to prioritize cutaways over stories, the choice to let Peter's character drift toward cruelty, the choice to retire the evil genius baby rather than develop him, the choice to flatten Brian into a function, the choice to make Meg's mistreatment a defining feature rather than a moment of vulnerability. These were choices. Each one had an alternative. But here is the paradox's full shape. Having made those choices, having become the diminished version of what it was, Family Guy is still here, still watched, still generating passionate discussion, still capable of individual moments of genuine brilliance that remind you what the show's fundamental abilities were, still employed as background noise and comfort viewing by millions of people who find in its familiar voices and rhythms something that reliably produces the particular quiet of a thing you know extremely well. The show that debuted to 22 million viewers in 1999 and the show that averages less than 1 million broadcast viewers today are measurably different things. They share characters, a creator, a format, a setting, but the heart that made the early seasons feel like something genuinely alive that has been harder to find, and finding it has required more patience with each passing season. And yet people keep watching, keep coming back, keep putting it on late at night when they need something familiar. The show has a strange immortality, the kind that comes not from continued excellence, but from deep embedding in cultural memory. Family Guy has been present in enough living rooms for long enough that it has become part of the furniture of a certain kind of American and international cultural life, regardless of whether its current episodes merit the residency. That is the paradox. It is both less than it was and more durable for being less. The very qualities that made it worse as a piece of art, the emphasis on brief, disconnected, shareable moments over sustained narrative, made it more resilient as a cultural artifact. In an era when sustained narrative is increasingly fragile and brief, disconnected, shareable moments are the currency of cultural survival. Seth MacFarlane, pitching that 15-minute pilot to Fox in May of 1998, did not know he was creating one of the most enduring pieces of American animated entertainment. He was making something he needed to make, something that had been developing in his imagination since his time at Hanna-Barbera, since the Larry Shorts, since whatever it was in a young animator's sensibility that produced this specific combination of sharp satire and genuine affection for the bumbling, well-meaning, profoundly imperfect people at the center of it. The show that resulted from that pitch was, in its best moments, exactly as good as the people who love those early seasons believe it was. The warmth underneath the chaos was real. The characters had genuine depth. The humor was earned. The family, for all its spectacular dysfunction, loved each other in ways that were visible and specific and moving. And the show that continued past those best moments has been, in its worst moments, a facsimile of that earlier thing, wearing the same character designs, using the same voices, located in the same fictional suburb of Rhode Island, but missing something essential that cannot quite be named and cannot quite be recovered. The paradox that the title promises is this: the same show can be the object of genuine fondness and genuine grief simultaneously. You can miss what it was while watching what it is. You can love the characters in the form you first knew them and mourn what happened to them afterward. You can fall asleep to an episode you have seen 30 times and feel, in the blur between wakefulness and sleep, like you are returning to something that still exists somewhere, not in the current seasons, not in the production that continues towards season 27 and the Stewie spin-off and whatever comes after that, but in the version of the show that exists in memory and in the earliest episodes and in whatever it is that keeps people reaching for it at the end of a long night. Family Guy is both a cautionary tale about what happens when a show stops protecting what made it good, and a testament to the strange power of a world that was built with enough care and specificity that it survived its own dismantling. The Griffins still live in their house on Spooner Street. Peter still crashes into things. Stewie still has his toys and his inventions and his love for Brian, even in a form that is only a partial echo of the child he once was. Brian still sits at the table drinking something he poured too early in the day. Lois still tries to hold everything together. They are all still there, even the diminished versions. And something in that persistence, that stubborn continued existence, has its own quiet comfort. Isn't that enough sometimes? On a night like this one? Isn't the familiar enough, even when the familiar is also a little sad? Let the breathing slow, let the thoughts get softer. The Griffins are still up to something, still making noise in their particular suburb of Rhode Island, still arguing and loving each other in their clumsy, exaggerated, sometimes beautiful way. You do not have to pay close attention. The show knows you are tired. It has been here for 25 years and it will be here when you wake up. The Family Guy paradox will still be unresolved in the morning. It has been unresolved for a decade and a half, and it will be unresolved for as long as the show continues and probably for years after that. Some things just are what they are, both less than they promised and more than you expected, both genuinely flawed and genuinely yours. Sleep well. Section 11. The road to episodes when Family Guy remembered what it was. There is a particular kind of episode in the Family Guy catalog that fans tend to return to with a warmth that surprises even themselves. These are the travel episodes, the adventure episodes, the ones where Stewie and Brian leave Quahog behind and go somewhere, and where the usual rhythms of the show are set aside in favor of something slower and more attentive. The Road to episodes, as they came to be known, represent something genuinely distinct within the Family Guy archive. They are not quite like anything else in the series, and if you want to understand what the show was capable of at its best, they are probably the place to start. The first of them was Road to Rhode Island, which aired during the second season in May of 2000. In this episode, Brian is sent to pick up Stewie from his maternal grandparents in Texas, and the two of them end up stranded and have to make their way back to Quahog Overland. It was a simple premise, and it drew self-consciously on the old Bob Hope and Bing Crosby Road pictures from the 1940s. The ones where two comedians go somewhere together and get into trouble and sing songs and irritate each other and eventually end up where they were going. The episode contained a musical number. It contained extended dialogue between two characters who were learning, through the accumulated small events of an unplanned journey, that they liked each other more than they were generally willing to admit. That detail, the two of them liking each other more than they were willing to admit, is the emotional core that makes the Road to episodes work, and that distinguishes them from so much of the later Family Guy material. The relationship between Brian and Stewie is the most consistently well-written relationship in the entire run of the show. It survived the degradation of both characters in their solo appearances. It persisted even as Brian became self-righteous and Stewie became silly, because whenever the two of them were placed in extended one-on-one contact, the writers seemed to remember what they were supposed to be to each other. What are they to each other exactly? The relationship is unusual enough that it resists easy categorization. Brian is not Stewie's parent, although there are moments where he functions almost parentally. Stewie is not Brian's child, although there are moments where the dynamic between them has the texture of a child being protected by an adult who is doing his imperfect best. They are closer, in some ways, to friends of a particular kind, the kind where the friendship is organized partly around the mutual recognition that neither of them belongs entirely in the world they are living in. Brian considers himself too sophisticated for Quahog and too unfulfilled for the domestic contentment that seems to satisfy everyone around him. Stewie considers himself too exceptional for the infantile world he has been trapped in, too aware and too capable for the crib and the playroom and the strained pureed carrots. They are both displaced people in their different ways, and the recognition of that shared displacement is what holds them together. Road to Europe came next, in the third season, and sent them abroad, Brian and Stewie attempting to reach England, Stewie searching for the home of his favorite British children's television program. It was funnier and more elaborate than the first Road to, and it extended the musical tradition with a pair of songs that remain among the more memorable things the show ever produced. But more than the jokes and the songs, what stayed was the sense of two characters genuinely experiencing something together, genuinely being changed by the events of the episode, rather than simply reacting to them and returning to baseline. Road to Rupert in Season 5 is considered by a segment of the fandom to be one of the finest Family Guy episodes across the entire run. It has a gentleness to it that is almost startling given the surrounding material, a story about Stewie trying to retrieve his stuffed animal from a child who bought it at a yard sale, and about Brian accompanying him on a road trip across the country to do so. The emotional register of that episode is soft and warm, in a way that the show rarely managed in its later seasons. Stewie's attachment to Rupert, his stuffed bear, is treated without irony. The show does not mock it. It does not undercut it with a joke that dissolves the feeling. It simply allows the attachment to be real, and in doing so produces an emotional sincerity that lands with unexpected weight. The later Road to episodes include Road to Germany, which time travels back to World War II, and Road to the Multiverse, which aired in Season 8 and is widely considered the pinnacle of the franchise. Road to the Multiverse is a particularly interesting piece of television. It is an episode that sends Brian and Stewie through a series of alternate universes, one where the universe was created by dogs rather than humans, and so dogs are the dominant species. One rendered in the style of a Disney animated feature, complete with musical number, one that exists inside a crude animated universe clearly inspired by a competing network's programming, one in a medieval setting, one in a post-apocalyptic landscape. Each universe is a sketch, a joke, a premise taken to a quick conclusion. But between the sketches, in the quiet moments of travel between universes, the episode finds time to simply be with its two main characters to let them exist together in the comfortable companionship that their best scenes always had. What makes Road to the Multiverse stand out even beyond its technical ambition is the finale. After all the traveling, after all the universes, Brian and Stewie end up back home in the Griffin house. And there is a moment, brief, quiet, deliberately underplayed, where the exhaustion of the journey settles over them and the episode allows them to simply be glad they are back. It is a small moment. It lasts only a few seconds. But it is the kind of moment that the surrounding seasons of Family Guy were systematically eliminating, and its presence in Road to the Multiverse explains why that episode is remembered, while so many other Season 8 and later episodes have blurred together into a general impression of noise. Road to the North Pole, which came later that same season, was a Christmas special that told a story of unusual emotional range for the series by that point. Stewie wants to visit Santa Claus, and Brian agrees to take him. What they find at the North Pole is not a magical winter wonderland, but a degraded, collapsing operation overwhelmed by the scale of modern consumer demand. Santa running himself to ruin, his reindeer half dead, the elves exhausted and resentful. Stewie and Brian, moved by what they see, decide to attempt to deliver the presents themselves. They do so, and it is awful and funny and eventually genuinely touching. The episode ends with a song that is legitimately lovely and that sticks in the memory in the way that only music can. It is worth noting how different these episodes feel from the surrounding material, because that difference illuminates something important about what the show was still capable of when the conditions were right. The Road to episodes consistently had something that most Family Guy episodes in the middle and later seasons did not. They had a reason to exist. There was something they were trying to do, some story they were trying to tell, some emotional experience they were trying to create in the viewer. The humor in them was in service of something larger. The jokes mattered because they were attached to characters who mattered. This is what the show abandoned, gradually, in its regular episodes, the sense that the episode existed for a purpose, that it was building towards something, that it had an emotional intention. The Road to episodes retained it, probably because their structure forced the writers to commit to sustained character interaction in a way that the standard episode format did not require. When you put two characters together for 22 minutes and send them somewhere, you cannot avoid the question of what happens between them. The journey provides a natural arc. The obstacles provide genuine stakes, even small ones. The conclusion provides genuine resolution. The lesson that the Road to episodes teach is not complicated. It is simply that Family Guy was capable, at any point in its run, of producing something worthwhile when the conditions demanded it. The conditions of the Road to format demanded genuine storytelling, and the show rose to meet those demands almost every time. The question the rest of the series poses is why the same demand was not made of the standard episodes, why the conditions that produced the Road to episodes were not replicated across the rest of the season, why the show that made Road to the Multiverse was also, in the same season, making episodes where the plot seemed to exist only to string together material that had no relationship to any character or any theme. The answer, if there is one, probably has to do with the difference between episodes that were made with care and episodes that were made to fill a slot. The Road to episodes were events. In the modest sense that word has in television, they were built with more attention, more ambition, more deliberate craft. The standard episodes were, increasingly, product. Not bad product necessarily, but product content manufactured to a schedule, assembled from available parts, delivered on time. The Road to episodes reminded the audience, and perhaps the writers, of what the show was capable of when it was not simply filling a slot but actually trying to do something. They remain some of the most rewatchable material in the Family Guy archive. In the quiet hours, when the rest of the show has blurred into a comfortable ambient presence, it is often the Road to episodes that surface in the memory with something specific attached, a scene, a line, a moment of unexpected feeling. That is what good television leaves behind, and the fact that Family Guy produced it, even intermittently, is part of why the paradox of this show is so genuinely interesting to sit with. Section 12. The supporting world: Quagmire, Cleveland, Joe, and the neighborhood. There is a tendency, when discussing Family Guy, to focus on the Griffin family itself, Peter, Lois, Brian, Stewie, and the children, and to treat the world around them as backdrop. But Quahog was always more than set dressing. The neighborhood that Seth MacFarlane and his writers constructed around the Griffins was populated with characters who, at their best, functioned as genuine extensions of the show's comedic and emotional universe, rather than simply recurring faces to be deployed when a particular joke required them. Glenn Quagmire is probably the most complicated case in this regard. He was introduced as Peter's neighbor and friend, a flight attendant with an extreme and broadly telegraphed interest in women, and the show used him for years as a particular kind of joke that relied on the audience's shared understanding that his behavior was awful and that his cheerful obliviousness to this was the source of the comedy. Quagmire was a caricature of a certain kind of mid-century male attitude, exaggerated to the point of cartoonishness, and in the early seasons the exaggeration was calibrated carefully enough that the joke worked. You were laughing at the attitude, not celebrating it. In the later seasons, the calibration slipped. This is a pattern familiar from other aspects of the show's decline, but it is particularly noticeable with Quagmire, because the character's defining trait is specifically transgressive. The comedy required a careful maintenance of the line between satirizing a problematic behavior and simply depicting it for laughs. The show managed this in the early seasons, partly through the warmth of the friendship that Quagmire had with Peter and the others. He was a person, flawed and familiar, not simply a vehicle for a single joke. When the character depth was stripped away, and Quagmire became increasingly a one-note delivery mechanism for the same recurring premise, the jokes lost their satirical edge and became something simpler and less interesting. There were exceptions. The episode where Quagmire discovers his father has been living as a woman and must decide how to respond to this is one of the more thoughtful pieces of writing the later show produced. Quagmire's initial rejection and eventual acceptance of his father's identity is handled with an unusual care, and the character's emotional arc in that episode, the confusion, the anger, the slow working through of feelings that do not fit neatly into the categories available to him, feels genuinely observed. It is exactly the kind of episode that demonstrated what the show was still capable of and made the surrounding mediocrity harder to understand. Joe Swanson, the police officer who lives next door to the Griffins and uses a wheelchair, was introduced with a backstory that gave him genuine emotional depth. He had been injured in the line of duty. He had built a life around that injury rather than collapsing under it. His relationship with his wife Bonnie was complicated and sometimes tense. His friendship with Peter was warm and occasionally touching in ways that the show never quite managed with Quagmire. Perhaps because Joe's defining characteristic was a kind of stoic dignity that provided a consistent anchor for the character across the seasons. Joe was also, importantly, a character who the show used well in the early seasons to make points about disability that were neither preachy nor dismissive. The humor around his situation was almost always humor that arose from his specific perspective on the world, from the gap between his physical limitations and the enormous, barely contained energy of his personality. He was not diminished by his disability in the show's framing. If anything, the contrast between the scale of his ambition and enthusiasm and the constraints of his situation was a source of genuine character comedy, rather than just easy target humor. Cleveland Brown deserves a special mention because Cleveland's arc within Family Guy is inseparable from the larger question of what the show was and what it was trying to do. Cleveland was Peter's quietest, most reserved friend, the one most likely to respond to absurdity with a soft, slightly baffled observation rather than enthusiasm. He was gentle where Quagmire was aggressive, thoughtful where Joe was impulsive, The friendship between Peter and Cleveland had a warmth that was distinct from Peter's other relationships, and Cleveland's gentle, unhurried responses to Peter's chaos gave him a comedic function that no other character could replicate. Then Cleveland got his own spin-off, The Cleveland Show, which ran from 2009 to 2013, and he was written off Family Guy. The Cleveland Show was set in a different city with a different supporting cast, and it lasted 4 seasons before being canceled, at which point Cleveland was written back into Family Guy, as if his absence had been brief and unremarkable. The whole episode of his departure and return said something about the show's relationship with its own continuity and its own characters. Cleveland's years away were largely waved aside, his return treated as a non-event. The rich comedic possibilities of what it might mean for these specific friends to have been separated and then reunited almost entirely unexplored. The neighborhood itself, the physical geography of Quahog as the show constructed it, had a coherence in the early seasons that gave the comedy somewhere to live. The Drunken Clam, the local bar where Peter and his friends gathered, was a real place in the way that the best television locations are real places. It had a feeling. It had the specific texture of a neighborhood bar where the same people have been sitting on the same stools for years, where the conversations are comfortable because they have been had 100 times before, where the familiarity is not just background but the whole point. Some of the show's best early scenes happened there, conversations that wandered, jokes that built slowly, the particular kind of male friendship that expresses itself entirely through ribbing and never through anything more direct. The show's world also included Quahog's civic institutions, the television station where Quagmire worked for a period, the various employers where Peter cycled through over the years, the school where the Griffin children were slowly and improbably educated. These settings provided the show with variety and with the opportunity to engage with the larger world of the characters rather than confining everything to the house and the bar. In the early seasons, these settings were used thoughtfully. They provided context, gave characters reasons to interact with new people, introduced new comedic situations that could not have been set up in the familiar domestic locations. In the later seasons, the settings became progressively less important because the stories were progressively less interested in the world the characters inhabited. The Quahog of the later seasons is more like a flat backdrop than a world it is present when required and absent when not. It lacks the texture that made it feel lived in during the first few years. This is another instance of the same general pattern: the erosion of investment in the specific, the preference for the generic, the slow replacement of a particular place within any place. Cleveland, Quagmire, and Joe at their best were mirrors for Peter characters whose different personalities and perspectives allowed the show to examine Peter from angles that no single friendship could provide. The ensemble functioned as a genuine ensemble when the show remembered to treat it that way, when the friendships were given room to breathe and when each character was allowed to be more than a one-note supporting player. What is lost when supporting characters are flattened into their most obvious attributes is not just character depth in the abstract, it is the specific texture of the world those characters inhabit. A neighborhood is not just buildings and streets. It is the accumulated histories of the people who live in it, the way their relationships with each other have shaped them, the specific flavor of a particular community of people who have chosen, or been unable to avoid, spending their lives in proximity. The Quahog of the early seasons had something of that texture. The Quahog of the later seasons largely does not. And the difference, though it might seem like a small thing, is part of why the earlier seasons feel alive in a way that the later seasons do not. On a night like this one, that texture is actually what you are reaching for when you put on an old episode. Not the specific jokes which you probably already know. Not the plot which you have seen before, but the feeling of a particular place inhabited by particular people, doing the particular things that those particular people do. That feeling is what good television leaves in the memory long after the plots have faded, and it is what the early seasons of Family Guy delivered with a consistency that makes them worth returning to even now, in the small hours, when you are looking for something that feels like company. Section 13. The episodes that still hold up a quiet defense. There is a version of the Family Guy conversation that focuses entirely on the show's failures, and it is not a dishonest conversation. The decline is real. The inconsistency is real. The gap between what the show was and what it became is large enough and clear enough that it cannot be argued away by selective citation of the better episodes. All of that is true. And yet, there is another version of this conversation, and it deserves its own space. Family Guy, across its run, produced a number of episodes that are genuinely excellent by any fair standard, episodes that are well-written, emotionally true, funny in ways that require actual craft, and that hold up to re-watching in a way that distinguishes them from disposable television. These episodes are not exceptions to the general rule that the show declined. They coexist with that decline, which is in some ways more interesting than if they were simply artifacts of a specific good period. They demonstrate that the capability was always present. The question was always whether it would be deployed. The episode And Then There Were Fewer, which opened Season 9, is a full-length parody of the murder mystery genre, specifically of the Agatha Christie tradition, of the closed-room mystery where a group of people are gathered in an isolated location and a killer is among them. Family Guy had done parody before, obviously, but And Then There Were Fewer was unusual in the commitment it brought to the form. The episode is genuinely tense in places. The mystery plot is constructed with enough care that the revelation of the killer's identity lands with actual impact. And the episode uses its extended format. It was a double-length episode, running close to 40 minutes to do something that the show rarely attempted. Sustained storytelling with a beginning, middle, and end that all serve the same purpose. The cast of the isolated house in that episode includes almost every recurring character in the Family Guy universe, and the episode uses their assembled personalities thoughtfully, rather than just deploying them for individual jokes. The interactions between characters who do not usually spend time together reveal new things about both parties. The mystery gives the characters something to react to collectively rather than in their usual isolated individual plots. The whole thing has the feeling of an occasion, a special episode that the writers treated with special care, and that care is visible in every scene. Brian and Stewie, sometimes called simply the Vault episode because it was filmed in the production style of a bottle episode, a minimal budget, single location production, is a different kind of standout. It aired in Season 8 and consists of almost nothing except Brian and Stewie trapped together in a bank vault over a weekend. No cutaways, no cutaway gags, no subplots in other locations. Just two characters, a small room, and 22 minutes. The episode is serious in a way that Family Guy rarely was by that point. Brian and Stewie drink the whiskey that Brian was carrying in his flask. They talk. Brian, drunk and desperate, reveals a suicidal ideation that Stewie reacts to with genuine horror and genuine anger. The anger of someone who cares about the person who has just said something unacceptable. The conversation that follows is painful and honest, and ends with a degree of emotional resolution that is earned rather than simply asserted. The episode was divisive when it aired. Some viewers found it too heavy, too far outside the show's established tonal register. Others found it revelatory, the proof that these characters were capable of carrying something real, that the relationship between Brian and Stewie was not just a comedic device, but a genuine bond with genuine stakes. Whatever your reaction to it, the episode is significant for what it demonstrates about the show's latent capacity. It is impossible to watch it and then watch a late-season episode full of random cutaways and see both as the product of the same limitations. They are the product of the same capabilities, deployed differently, one with care and intention, one without. Back to the Pilot, a Season 10 episode, uses time travel to send Brian and Stewie back to the very first episode of Family Guy. The episode is funny, in the way that any good time travel parody is funny. The self-referential humor, the observation of how much has changed, the jokes about the earlier character designs. But underneath the parody is something more interesting. A genuine affection for what the show was, a quiet acknowledgement by the writers of the distance between the original and the current. Brian's encounter with his own earlier self has a melancholy undertone, a sense that the earlier version of the character had something the current version has lost. Whether that was intentional or accidental is impossible to know, but it is there. There are comedy episodes that hold up too, not just the dramatic or emotionally ambitious ones. Road to the Multiverse has been discussed already, but it belongs on any list of the show's genuine achievements. PTV, a Season 4 episode about the FCC's relationship with broadcast television content, is a sharp and genuinely funny satire that holds up because it is about something real, and because its jokes arise from its subject matter rather than being imported from elsewhere. The episode has a point of view. It is arguing something in the comic way that good satire argues things, and the clarity of that argument gives every joke a purpose. The episodes that hold up have several things in common, and the list is short enough to be worth stating plainly. They have characters who behave consistently with who those characters are supposed to be. They have stories with purposes the episode exists to get somewhere, and the somewhere matters. The humor is attached to something, to a character's specific personality, to a situation's specific logic, to a theme that the episode is exploring. And the emotions, when present, are treated with something approaching respect. The show does not undercut its own sincerity before the audience has had time to experience it. That last quality is perhaps the most important and the hardest to consistently achieve. The instinct to undercut sincerity, to deflate a genuine moment before it can become maudlin, to signal through irony that the show is aware of how it might look if it let itself be serious, is understandable, but corrosive when overused. The early Family Guy managed its sincerity carefully, deploying it in specific moments that were prepared for and followed through on. The later show became so reflexively defensive about its own emotions that genuine feeling became almost impossible to sustain. The best episodes of the later seasons are the ones where the writers overrode that reflex and let something breathe. A quiet defense of Family Guy is not a claim that it was consistently great. It is only a claim that it was, at various points across its 25-year run, genuinely great. That the episodes mentioned here, and others, contain scenes and performances and emotional moments that belong in any honest account of what television animation has been capable of. The show does not need to be defended against the charge that it declined. It declined, but it produced real things along the way, and those real things deserve to be named. There is a particular comfort in knowing that. When you put on a Family Guy episode in the early hours of the morning, not entirely sure which season you have landed in, you are not guaranteed quality. But you are not guaranteed emptiness either. The show's history is uneven enough that almost any era contains something worth finding, some scene or episode where the writers remembered what they were doing and did it well. That unevenness is part of the show's character now. It is part of the texture of 25 years. And there is something appropriate about the fact that a show about a family defined by its imperfections ended up being, itself, a body of work defined by its imperfections, wonderful and frustrating in turns, capable of more than it usually delivered, still capable of surprising you when you least expect it. Section 14, 25 Years, a spin-off and the question that never gets answered. At some point in the middle of any long conversation about a television show, there comes a moment where the question shifts from the show itself to what the show means, what it represents, what its continued existence says about the culture that keeps watching it, what the accumulated weight of 25 years adds up to when you step back and look at it whole. Family Guy premiered on the 31st of January 1999. As of the time this script was written, it is still in production. A deal announced in the spring of 2025 renewed the show through 2028 and 2029, guaranteeing at least 4 more seasons. A spin-off centered on Stewie Griffin was greenlit in 2026, a full series built around the character, following him through a version of the adventures that the Road To episodes always gestured toward, presumably without the constraint of returning him to Quahog at the end of every episode. Seth MacFarlane is attached to the spin-off as a voice. The machine is still running. 25 years is a long time for anything in the entertainment industry. Television history is littered with shows that came and went in a season, with cultural phenomena that burned bright and extinguished quickly, with programs that lasted a respectable 5 or 7 years and then wrapped up before they could exhaust either themselves or their audience. The shows that last 25 years in any form are rare, and the shows that last 25 years, while remaining culturally present, while remaining a thing that people talk about and argue about and stream in enormous quantities, are rarer still. Family Guy is one of them. And the question of why, the genuine question, the one without an obvious answer, is more interesting than the simpler question of whether it is good. We have spent a considerable amount of time on whether it is good, or was good, or has been good at various points. The why of its persistence goes somewhere different. Part of the answer is habitual comfort. There is a generation of viewers for whom Family Guy is not primarily a show to evaluate, but a show that has simply been there, that was on in the background during their adolescence. That was the thing their older sibling watched. That was the first piece of genuinely adult-oriented content they ever encountered in a form designed for younger audiences. For those viewers, the show carries a freight of personal memory that is entirely independent of its artistic quality. Watching it is not an aesthetic choice, so much as a return to a version of yourself that existed in a particular room at a particular age, watching the glow of a television late at night when you should have been asleep. That kind of attachment does not diminish because the show declined. If anything, it becomes more intense the earlier, better episodes become more precious precisely because they represent something irretrievable, a specific moment in personal history that cannot be accessed by any other means. The later, weaker episodes are tolerated because the presence of the show is more important than the quality of any particular episode. You are not watching the episode. You are watching the show, the whole thing, the accumulated object of 25 years. Part of the answer is streaming, which has given old content a second and third life that broadcast television never could. Family Guy on Hulu can be discovered by a 12-year-old in 2026 who was not alive when the show premiered, who has no nostalgic relationship with it, but who finds in its early seasons the same anarchic energy that original audiences found in 1999. The streaming context strips away the cultural baggage, the arguments about decline, the insider knowledge about which seasons are worth watching, and presents the show as a library, a collection of content to be sampled without any particular order or context. A viewer approaching it that way might end up watching a classic Season 2 episode followed by a weak Season 14 episode followed by a strong Season 8 Road to, and arrive at an impression of the show that is genuinely different from the impression formed by watching it week by week across its broadcast run. Part of the answer is that the show, even at its worst, is never boring in the specific way that bad television can be boring. A weak Family Guy episode is not a slow, ponderous, dramatically inert piece of content. It is an energetic, loud, fast-moving, densely packed piece of content that happens to be substituting random noise for genuine comedy. That is still, in some perverse way, watchable. The pace keeps you engaged even when the material does not earn that engagement. The show never learned to be subtle, and in the middle of the night, when you want something to fill the darkness without demanding anything from you, the relentless forward motion of even a mediocre Family Guy episode has its uses. The spin-off, when it arrives, will be its own question to answer. A show built entirely around Stewie Griffin, the character who was most interesting when he was placed in contrast with the mundane domesticity he resented, will need to find a new source of tension to replace the one that generated the original character. What Stewie is against, narratively speaking, is the world of the Griffin household. The oblivious parents, the siblings who ignore him, the terrible smallness of baby life. When you remove him from that world permanently and send him on adventures, you change the fundamental conditions of the character. Whether the writers find a new set of conditions that are equally generative is an open question. The history of spin-offs in television is not particularly encouraging, but neither is it categorical. Occasionally, a character who was supporting in one context becomes primary in another, and the transition works, and the things that made the character interesting in the original context find new ways to express themselves. The Stewie spin-off and the 4 additional seasons of the main show are evidence that the machine created by one young man's $50,000 student film in the mid-1990s is not done yet. Whatever you think about the current quality of that machine's output, and the conversation has been long and detailed enough that you have probably formed your own view, the durability of it is genuinely remarkable. Not many things made by human beings for human entertainment last 25 years. Even fewer remain vital enough to justify spin-offs and multi-season renewals after that length of run. Seth MacFarlane, who started all of this in his early 20s with a talking dog and a not very smart man, is now in his early 50s. He has had a career that expanded far beyond the cartoon that made him famous film work, recorded music, a network television drama that he created and starred in, and that found a devoted audience of its own. He has moved through the culture with a persistence and versatility that was probably not entirely predictable from the evidence of that early student film. And Family Guy, the thing he made when he was barely an adult, is still running. There is something worth sitting with in that image. A person makes a thing. The thing outlasts its original moment, survives cancellation, is resurrected, declines, persists, declines further, continues anyway. The thing that the person made in the full flush of their early ambition has now been running for longer than some of its current viewers have been alive. It exists in the culture as something both entirely familiar and perpetually strange. You know it. You have always known it. And yet it remains capable of producing an episode you have never seen, a scene that catches you off guard, a moment of genuine comedy or genuine feeling that you did not expect to find there. The Family Guy paradox, the gap between what the show promised and what it became, between the evidence of its best episodes and the evidence of its worst, between its creative decline and its commercial persistence will not resolve. It will continue, probably, for as long as the show continues, and possibly for some time after. That is not a failure of the paradox. That is just what some things are. Complex, inconsistent, better and worse than they seem depending on when you look, alive in ways that evade easy categorization. You have been listening to this for a long time now. The room has probably gotten quieter around you. Whatever light was on when you started has likely dimmed. Your breathing, if you have been following it at all, has probably slowed in the way that breathing slows when the body is ready to stop being awake. That is exactly right. That is exactly what this was for. The Griffins are still out there in their particular Rhode Island suburb, still arguing about nothing important, still eating their meals and watching television and stumbling through the small catastrophes of ordinary life. The lights are on in the house on Spooner Street. Somewhere in there, Brian is on the couch with a drink. Stewie is in the crib, or the time machine, or somewhere between them. Peter is probably doing something that will require fixing in the morning. Lois is managing all of it with the slightly exhausted patience of someone who made her choices a long time ago and has learned to find the love in them. It is a family. It is a strange and improbable and frequently maddening family, made of lines and paint and the voices of people you will never meet, assembled in a writer's room and a recording studio and an animation house and sent out into the world to be whatever it would be to whoever would have it. 25 years later, it is still being whatever it is. Sleep well. If you made it through this one, thank you. Genuinely. Drop a like if this kept you company tonight. It costs nothing, and it tells me these long, slow, exploratory videos are worth making. And if you want to be here for the next one, the subscribe button is right there waiting for you. The algorithm rewards it. I appreciate it, and there are more stories like this one on the way. Take care of yourselves out there. Script written for Uncle Guy Lore. Optimized for 11 Labs voiceover generation. All information drawn from publicly available sources and verified where possible. Total length, 30,000 plus words. Expansion, the writing room and the ghost of the original voice. There is something worth dwelling on, something that often gets overlooked in discussions of Family Guy's decline that focus primarily on the visible symptoms of the problem rather than its deeper structural roots. A television writing room is a living organism. It has a culture, a set of shared assumptions, an internal grammar that determines what kinds of jokes feel right and what kinds of stories feel worth telling. The best writing rooms develop these cultures organically, over time, through the accumulated experience of working together, and through the influence of a strong central voice that the rest of the room calibrates itself against. That central voice does not have to come from the showrunner, though it usually does. It can come from any particularly strong writer whose sensibility the room absorbs and amplifies. But some show has that voice, and when it is gone, the room tends to drift. In Family Guy's earliest seasons, that voice was unmistakably Seth MacFarlane's. The show had a specific way of looking at things, a particular combination of genuine warmth and sharp absurdist comedy, of satire that was willing to be cruel about institutions and ideas, while remaining fundamentally affectionate toward people, of formal experimentation with the cutaway format that treated the format as a tool in service of character rather than as a substitute for it. That combination was not generic. It was not something that could be produced by any capable writer given the right instructions. It came from somewhere specific, from a specific person with a specific set of preoccupations and a specific kind of intelligence. When MacFarlane was in the room, the other writers had a living reference point. They could pitch a joke and see, in real time, whether it landed in the register that the show was trying to hit. They could feel, through the reaction of the person whose sensibility defined the show's identity, whether what they were producing was actually Family Guy or just something that resembled Family Guy from the outside. This kind of real-time calibration is invaluable, and it is also invisible. It never appears in any document or credit. It cannot be transmitted through a series of notes or guidelines, and it disappears completely when the person providing it steps away. After the first cancellation, when the show came back from that 3-year gap and began losing pieces of its original writing staff, this calibration became less precise. After the second cancellation, after the revival, after the writing room had been significantly restaffed with people who had come to the show from the outside rather than built it from the inside, the calibration became less precise still. And after MacFarlane himself stepped back from active creative oversight around 2011, the central reference point was gone entirely. What remained was a set of conventions, formal conventions about cutaway structure, character conventions about who these people were and how they talked, tonal conventions about what the show considered funny, but conventions without the living intelligence that had generated them in the first place. This is a more subtle kind of decline than the one you can point to in specific episodes. It does not show up clearly in any individual script or scene. It shows up in aggregate, in the texture of many episodes across many seasons, in the gradual attrition of whatever it was that made the show feel like it had been made by someone who cared about it. Good television can be made by writers working from conventions. What those writers could not do, and what no group of writers working from inherited conventions can do, is maintain the quality of something that was originally generated by genuine personal investment. The original creative impulse behind a show is not reproducible by the people who come after it. It can be honored and extended and occasionally matched in individual moments of inspiration, but the baseline of felt life that a show has, when it is being made by its creator at full engagement, is something that gradually leaches out once the creator is gone. This is not a criticism of Rich Appel or Alex Sulkin or any of the other writers who worked on Family Guy after MacFarlane stepped back. They are talented professionals doing a genuinely difficult job, which is to keep something alive that was never designed to live as long as it has. But there is no criticism in acknowledging a structural reality. The show they inherited was not the same as the show they would have created themselves, and the longer they ran it, the more it became theirs rather than MacFarlane's, which is also to say the more it drifted from the specific combination of qualities that made the early seasons exceptional. What you notice, watching the later seasons with this in mind, is not a catastrophic failure of craft or a complete absence of quality. There are funny episodes. There are strong individual scenes. There are moments that feel like genuine creative achievement. What you notice, rather, is a certain imprecision about what the show is trying to do and what it values. The early seasons had a strong point of view about everything, about what kind of comedy was worth making, about what kind of story was worth telling, about where the emotional center of the Griffin family resided. The later seasons feel more like a show that is executing a set of inherited conventions with varying degrees of success. Unsure in its deeper nature whether it is a dark comedy or a sentimental family show, a shock comedy or a character study, a satirical project, or a pure entertainment machine. The early seasons were all of those things at once, held in a specific balance. The later seasons could not always maintain that balance because the person who had originally found it was no longer in the room to check whether the balance was being kept. Expansion. The specific genius of the road to episodes. In the broad landscape of what Family Guy produced across its first decade and beyond, the Road to episodes stand as a distinct category of achievement, one that is worth examining closely both for what it shows about what the show was capable of and for what it reveals about the specific nature of the Stewie and Brian relationship that became the show's creative center of gravity after the revival. The Road to series began in Season 2 with Road to Rhode Island, which established the template. Brian and Stewie, separated from the rest of the family, are forced to travel together and bond through whatever absurd circumstances the writers construct for them. The series was a direct homage to the classic Bob Hope and Bing Crosby Road, to films of the 1940s, and it wore that homage openly, including songs, musical comedy sequences, and the particular rhythm of two mismatched personalities generating comedy through the friction of their differences. What made the Road to episodes work, and what made them reliably some of the strongest episodes in any season they appeared in, was that they were structurally insulated from the show's worst habits. They did not require Peter's character to be anything in particular. They did not require the rest of the Griffin family to be present. They did not need to resolve in any particular way because they existed slightly outside the show's main continuity, in the adventurous register of a special event, rather than the default register of a regular episode. And they allowed Brian and Stewie to demonstrate, in concentrated form, what the best version of their friendship looked like: the intellectual sparring, the genuine affection underneath the bickering, the comedy of two completely different personalities forced into close quarters by circumstances neither would have chosen. Road to Europe in Season 4, which sent Brian and Stewie to England and Germany after Stewie became obsessed with a British children's television character, produced some of the series' sharpest humor, alongside its most distinctive musical sequences. Road to Rupert in Season 5, which sent them to Colorado and back after Stewie lost his beloved stuffed animal, was an emotionally effective episode that managed to make Stewie's attachment to a stuffed toy feel genuinely moving rather than merely comic. Road to the Multiverse in Season 8, which sent them across parallel versions of reality, each constructed around a different artistic or cultural style, is frequently cited by fans as one of the single best episodes the show ever produced in any format. A piece of pure creative invention that felt, in its best sequences, like the work of writers at the top of their game who had been given space to do something genuinely unusual. Road to the North Pole in Season 9 was a Christmas special that doubled as one of the darkest and most emotionally complicated things the show ever attempted. A genuine meditation on disappointment, on the gap between myth and reality, and on the limits of what even the best intentions can accomplish in a broken world. It contained some graphic violence that divided audiences, but it also contained genuine emotional weight and a willingness to sit with sadness that the standard Family Guy episode format rarely allowed. Road to India in Season 15, and the most recent entries in the series have been more variable in quality, but they have consistently been among the stronger episodes of any season they appear in. What the Road to episodes demonstrate most clearly is something that the rest of the show increasingly failed to demonstrate: that Family Guy was capable of producing complete, satisfying narrative experiences with genuine emotional texture when its writers committed to telling a story with a clear beginning, a sustained middle, and an earned ending. The episodes worked because someone decided to make them work, to give them real attention and real craft. They were the exception that proved what the rule could have been, and the fact that the rest of the show's output diverged so dramatically from what these episodes demonstrated was possible is one of the clearest illustrations of the choices that Family Guy made and did not have to make. Expansion, Quagmire, Cleveland, and the supporting cast. The decline of Family Guy was not only a story about the four characters Peter, Brian, Stewie, Meg, whose transformations have been covered in detail. It was also a story about what happened to the show's supporting cast, which in the early seasons had been populated with characters who felt like genuine additions to the world rather than simply recurring props. Glenn Quagmire, the womanizing neighbor voiced by McFarlane, was one of the show's most complex early supporting characters. The comedy around Quagmire in Seasons 1 through 3 operated on a specific kind of uncomfortable honesty. He was genuinely sleazy in ways that real human beings can be genuinely sleazy, and the show's willingness to depict his behavior with specificity rather than sanitizing it was part of what gave the early seasons their edge. But Quagmire was also, underneath his worst habits, depicted as someone with a genuine social life, genuine friendships, and occasional moments of real vulnerability that made him feel like a person rather than just a set of punchlines about his specific appetites. As the show aged, Quagmire became increasingly one-dimensional in the opposite direction from most of the other character declines. Where Peter became crueler and Brian became more insufferable and Stewie became softer, Quagmire became more aggressively defined by his single characteristic, the womanizing at the expense of everything else that had made him interesting. His relationship with Brian became one of the defining ongoing dynamics of the later seasons, but it was a dynamic built primarily on mutual antagonism rather than on the kind of genuine character complexity that might have produced something more interesting. The Jerome is the New Black episode from Season 8, in which Quagmire delivers a detailed and specific speech about why he dislikes Brian, became a famous piece of the show's later mythology, not because it was a good example of how Quagmire was written, but because it was the show briefly remembering to let a character say something true. Quagmire's speech worked not because of anything particular about Quagmire, but because it was a vehicle for genuine character criticism aimed at Brian. The content was sharp, even if the framing was clumsy. The speech said things about Brian that the audience had been thinking for seasons, and the relief of hearing a character say them directly was enough to make the scene memorable, regardless of whether it served Quagmire as a person. Cleveland Brown was a different kind of loss. Cleveland in the early seasons was one of the most warmly drawn characters in the show, a gentle, soft-spoken contrast to Quagmire's aggressiveness and Joe's bluster, the kind of friend whose even temperament made him the reliable center of the group's dynamic. His relationship with Peter was one of the warmest in the show, built on genuine affection and mutual respect rather than the transactional quality that characterized many of the show's later male friendships. Cleveland got a spin-off in 2009 called The Cleveland Show, which aired for 4 seasons before cancellation and which effectively removed him from Family Guy for the duration of its run. When he returned to Family Guy after The Cleveland Show ended, something had shifted. Cleveland was less central, less warmly drawn, more likely to appear in the background of scenes rather than at their center. The spin-off period had cost him something in terms of his place in the show's ensemble, and he never quite recovered it. Joe Swanson, the police officer neighbor whose disability had been treated with surprising respect and specificity in the early seasons, underwent the same kind of decline that affected most of the show's supporting characters. The joke about Joe shifted, as was detailed earlier in this discussion, from his being defined by what he was capable of despite his circumstances to being defined primarily by his circumstances themselves. His disability became the punchline rather than the context from which more complex comedy emerged. His marriage with Bonnie deteriorated into a running joke about a relationship that both parties seemed to want to escape. The warm, capable, admired neighbor of Season 1 became the sad, diminished, occasionally pathetic figure of the later seasons, not because life had broken him through any organic story development, but because the show needed a target and he was available. These supporting character declines mattered to the show's quality not because any individual character's decline was catastrophic, but because the aggregate effect was a world that felt progressively less like a place real people might inhabit. The early show had a sense of genuine community around the Griffin family, neighbors and friends, and recurring characters whose lives existed independently of whatever plot the Griffins were driving in any given episode. The later show felt increasingly like a set of props arranged around the main characters, there to serve whatever joke or situation the episode required, and having no independent existence beyond that function. The difference between a world and a set is significant for how comfortable it feels to spend time in. The early seasons of Family Guy felt like a world. The later seasons, at their worst, felt like a set, the right shapes in the right places, but without the lived-in quality that made the original feel like somewhere you could actually go. Expansion. The fans who never left and what that says. One of the most interesting things about Family Guy's continued existence is the nature of the audience that has persisted through every season of decline, through every creative disappointment, through every moment where the show did something that made even its most loyal defenders wince. There is a particular kind of fan relationship that develops between a person and a show they loved intensely in their formative years. It does not quite end when the show declines. It transforms into something more complicated and more durable, a combination of genuine continued affection for what the show was, continued engagement with what the show is, even in diminished form, and a kind of protective loyalty that makes the fan unwilling to fully condemn even the worst episodes because doing so would feel like condemning something that is, in some sense, part of who they are. Family Guy arrived in most people's lives at a specific moment: adolescence, early adulthood, the years when you are first developing a sense of humor that is genuinely your own rather than simply inherited from your parents. The show was raw and irreverent, and specifically not for children in ways that felt important to the people who were first discovering it. Laughing at Family Guy was, for a lot of its original audience, a way of asserting a kind of comedic adulthood, an ability to handle dark humor and taboo breaking that marked a transition from the kind of entertainment you had watched as a child to the kind you watched as someone old enough to make their own choices about content. That association between the show and that formative experience does not dissolve when the show declines. It persists. Which is why people who would objectively describe current Family Guy as significantly worse than the show they first loved in 2003 or 2006 still put it on when they need something familiar in the background. Still feel a complicated fondness for the characters that does not track with their critical assessment of the current writing, still find themselves laughing at individual moments, even in seasons they would not recommend to anyone encountering the show for the first time. This is not irrationality. It is the normal function of formative cultural experiences. The shows and books and films that shape your sense of humor or your aesthetic sensibility during the years when those things are being formed have a different kind of presence in your life than the things you encounter later, however much better those later things might be by any objective measure. Family Guy is, for a very large number of people who are now in their 30s and 40s, part of the architecture of their humor, not a show they would necessarily choose to watch today if they had no prior relationship with it, but something that still functions as a kind of cultural home, regardless of what has been built in it recently. The streaming data supports this reading. The overwhelming majority of Family Guy's streaming consumption is of older episodes, the seasons from the original run through the early to mid-revival period, the episodes that the audience who found the show through Adult Swim and DVD sales in 2003 and 2004 and 2005 actually love. The show's library value is not evenly distributed across all 23-plus seasons. It is concentrated in the episodes where the show was actually good, and those episodes are being watched continuously, reliably, in enormous numbers, by people who are returning to something they love rather than discovering something new. This is the final, strangest layer of the Family Guy paradox. The show's continued production is partly justified by the value of a library whose most valuable content is the product of a creative period that ended years ago. The current seasons are generating new content that will presumably fill out the library going forward, but the current seasons are not the reason the library is valuable. The reason the library is valuable is the first 12 or so seasons. The show that is being made today is, in a commercial sense, being subsidized by the show that was made when it was still operating at its best. The declining current version is traveling on the reputation and genuine quality of the version that preceded it. This is a strange way to exist. It is also, given everything that has been said in this video, a completely understandable one. The early Family Guy earned something that has proven more durable than anyone could have anticipated in 1999 or even in 2005. It earned a place in the cultural life of a generation. That place does not evaporate when the show declines. It persists as a kind of inheritance diminished in new editions, but fundamentally intact in everything that was put there during the years when the show was genuinely great. And so the paradox holds. Family Guy is both less than it was and more than nothing. It is both a cautionary story about creative decline and a testament to the power of genuine quality to generate lasting affection that outlasts the circumstances of its creation. It is a show that chose to get worse in specific ways that can be identified and named, and it is also a show that will be remembered with genuine love by millions of people who encountered it when it was something worth loving. Both of those things are true at the same time. They do not cancel each other out. They are just the truth about what Family Guy is: complicated and sad and funny and still, somehow, here.